Dr. Sean O'Mara, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you here. I want to talk about visceral fat. Help us understand what is it and give us a few reasons why it's so dangerous inside the body.
Yeah, so a good name, because people hear about visceral fat, it's often described in other ways like deep belly fat, but some cool names that I like to refer to it as invisible obesity, because it's the kind of fat that you don't know about. So it's invisible, it's deep in your abdomen. Another term that I've heard that is, I'll give credit to, is Carl Lenore's Superhuman Radio. He calls it radioactive fat. And so it's this fat, from the concept that it actually has inflammatory properties. It's not really radioactive, but it's the notion that it has the ability to influence tissues outside of itself. And the way it does that, Dhru, is through inflammatory molecules that it's constantly leaking and producing and sending throughout the body. So it's a proximity to the vascular system that allows it to be distributed throughout the body. And then it has this untoward inflammatory effect in all the tissues. So keep in mind, chronic disease, we hear about the common pathway of chronic disease is inflammation. And it's my clinical experience that visceral fat is behind all of that. I mean, it's got this association or causality yet to be proven in many cases to virtually every form of chronic disease. So one of the interesting things I like to let people think about when it comes to visceral fat is if you have a malady, a certain form of chronic disease, just go on Google or AI and Google, put in the search term whatever you have, comma, and then list visceral fat. The other technical term for it is visceral adipose tissue. Adipose means fat. So a variety of terms are used to describe visceral fat, but it is a really bad player because of its influence throughout your body. So I think that's a pretty good introduction to its association with chronic disease. And then anecdotally, I would like to share that I studied it for 7 years for the National Science Foundation, a grant that we received. And during that time, we looked at, in 6,000 people, their chronic disease, things that they identified as forms of chronic disease they were suffering. And as we focused on eliminating visceral fat in those individuals, all of their forms of chronic disease either got better or completely reversed. It was amazing as they got rid of visceral fat, and to the extent they did. So symptomatology and conditions reverse better if you eliminate more of that visceral fat, and only partially improve if you just eliminate to a little bit. So that was absolutely shocking to see that something as profoundly connected to pathology and disease was never shared with me in medical school. We only learned about it through this study. But, there's a lot of studies. If you Google visceral fat, and just like I invited people to go on Google or AI and look at its association with whatever condition they might be afflicted with, it's connected with so many conditions. It's been very well researched. But the problem is I've never seen something so valuable in the research lane kept from practitioners, physicians. It's inexplicable how something as powerful as this biomarker is kept from medical schools. The curriculums in medical schools are standardized. I went to both a law school, I'm an attorney as well as a physician. And I remember there are good law schools and bad law schools. But in the United States, there is no bad medical school. And that's because all the curriculum is set, and they're very, very good professional schools. The downside to that is because that curriculum is set and standardized, we don't have really good curriculum and not so good curriculum. So it's all kind of cookie cutter. And ubiquitous in all these medical schools is a lack of awareness about visceral fat and some of the other biomarkers that we learned about in our study for the National Science Foundation, in addition to visceral fat. So there's two images here, image on the top and image on the bottom. And when it comes to MRIs of the abdomen and looking at visceral fat, what you want to do is have the healthiest abdomen as possible. And the characteristics of a really healthy abdomen is generally it's oval shaped. So it's not protuberant. You don't have what you might imagine is what a dad bod might look like, a big barrel belly. You want a more oval shape. So take yourself back to when you were maybe 14, 15 years old, and you had a very oval shaped flat abdomen. That is the kind of abdomen you want to have even as an adult. And you want to see mostly dark. So in this image here, you see a lot of dark structures. And so on an MRI, muscle shows up as dark, and so do visceral organs like the small intestine, colon, and bone. So this is the vertebral body. And this, by the way, are the psoas muscles, which are known as your core. So anybody watching that can see that, those are the buggers that hurt so bad when you do a core workout. And they're very important to health. Now, the white is anytime fat is present and an MRI scan shows up as white. This individual here has very little white, so very little visceral fat, contrasting it to the individual on the bottom. So this scan here is Asif, who's a friend of mine that I met at a gym, actually in a sauna, and a great guy. And I bought him this MRI to help him out. I just paid for it out of my own pockets to help Asif because he wants to go back and help poor kids in Bangladesh get educated. I'm like, gosh, I want to help this guy. And I could tell he had a lot of visceral fat, and he sure did. So this is a scan you don't want to be because it's mostly white. So if you ever get an abdominal scan, an MRI scan, you're going to have a real hard time getting it read. So it's good that you're watching the podcast today so you can learn about it. So you want very little white and you want mostly dark. And Asif is just filled with visceral fat. And then outside of his musculature is what's called subcutaneous fat. So that's just fat underneath the skin. And Asif has a lot of subcutaneous fat, but he predominantly is concentrated with visceral fat. And then Gabe, who's a friend of mine in the Army National Guard, has very little visceral fat, and he has a nice, healthy layer of subcutaneous fat. So he's got a six-pack, and that's his belly button, and these are his back muscles, and these are his obliques. And you want to have nice, dark muscles without a lot of fat streaks in it. Asif has these streaks of white in here. So this image here are both really important for your audience to understand the contrasting difference between healthy and unhealthy. We only see the outside of the body, but it's important, I think, to use an MRI to understand what else is going on the inside of the body. And having done this thousands of times now for people, it's very powerful to see what happens to somebody when they get to look inside their abdomen. It's almost like we can dismiss how we look in a mirror because we get accustomed to it. But it's like a magic looking glass. When you see inside your abdomen, you get a perspective you've never seen before. You're not accustomed to it. And so that's a really good chance for you to form new habits. And there's science behind this that if you change your environment and you're in a new environment, you can actually break habits and form new habits better just by being in a new environment. So I think what we're able to do is with an MRI, if you've never seen inside yourself, it's a little bit like that you go in an environment that you've never seen before, and suddenly you can now break bad habits and form new habits. And that's what we did with all these thousands of people in the National Science Foundation. We basically got them in a new environment, took them inside their body, and they broke their bad habits and formed good habits that they'd never been able to do just looking at their old familiar space.
Well, we're going to break down everything that you recommended for them, everything you do yourself. And in fact, this is a great opportunity to do your before and after of you being on this journey. Can we bring up the photo that you have of you? So here's your before and after. Again, if you're listening on podcast, we have the link inside the show notes to this image as well that people can look at on our website. but describe it for them. And if you're on YouTube, you can see these before and after photos. So this is you on the left.
Yep.
And what age is this?
So I'm 48 here. And in this particular image, I look pretty much like any other 48-year-old. I could walk by you in a shopping mall. I could take care of you. I'm an ER physician at that particular point full time. I could take care of you and you would not think anything of it. But what this face shows is the influence of visceral fat on my face. So it causes inflammation throughout your body and gives you this puffy, inflamed look to your face. And it's there basically showing we wear our health on our face. Probably more than any other feature in our body, our faces project and tell to our fellow humans how well we're doing at life. And really, how well you're doing in life is communicated by how healthy you are. So I look very average, but unfortunately, I am not healthy in this particular image. And then 11 years later, my image on the right, which is just about 6 months ago, shows the dramatic difference where the face, the shape of my face has become much leaner. Now, lots of people lose weight, Dhru, and it's really dependent upon the type of weight you lose. Maybe you lose muscle, and when you lose muscle, instead of losing fat, you don't have a favorable reflection in the appearance of your face. In other words, you don't derive a beneficial improvement in the appearance of your face if you are losing the wrong kind of tissue. But if you lose, and particularly, and the same applies with fat, if you lose visceral fat, your face looks much better than if you lose subcutaneous fat. So the MRI allows us to focus in on what is really harmful and what is beneficial. Superficial subcutaneous fat, and we can get into that maybe later, is actually beneficial, and visceral fat is very bad. So my profound change here is based on my passionate 7 years of researching visceral fat and focusing on eliminating it in myself. And so I like to describe for audiences, I don't look like I'm 16, but the shape of my face has returned to the shape that I formerly had when I was about 16 or 20, because I had, at that age, much less visceral fat, and I didn't have the influence of visceral fat deteriorating my face. So what I tell people is, you won't ever look like you're 16 again, but the shape of your face can look more like you're 16 and 20. And so we should, improve the shape of our bodies, improve the shape of our faces, and the capacity to have a healthier looking face corresponds to your ability to be a better influencer. And that's part of our mission. Our mission in life is to live well and to be able to influence other people to live well also. And to the extent you're healthy, you're better at being an influencer.
For those that are listening on the audio, your face on the right-hand side, which is you now, definitely feels more features. It's less puffy. It's less inflamed. It obviously is clear that you look at your face, there's a shift. But interestingly enough, and we're going to come back to it later, you actually weigh more in the after photo. You weigh 178, which is, I'm guessing, your weight now. You're older and you weigh more, but you actually look younger and more youthful. We're going to come back to that in a second. But first, let's talk about the basics. What are the top drivers of visceral fat, and why is it such an explosion of visceral fat in our modern day society?
Yeah. So the big 5 things that we have found that contribute the most to visceral fat, based on our experience with the National Science Foundation and using this MRI to evaluate it, is first and foremostly processed foods. So when you eat a lot of processed foods, and maybe I'll just pull up this image here to support that you contribute to visceral fat. So let's demonstrate for those watching here the elimination of processed foods. If you simply only eliminate processed foods and you didn't do anything else, so you want to limit your confounders. In other words, we didn't do medications, we didn't do exercise, we didn't have this individual do a sauna, we didn't have them fast or any anything else other than simply eliminate processed foods, processed carbohydrates in particular.
And just to be clear, we're talking about ultra processed foods, or we're talking about, because, processed foods as a term can be kind of confusing to people. Some people will say guacamole is processed, right? But you're talking about, first and foremost, ultra processed foods.
Yeah.
But then also it sounds like you're talking about some minimally processed foods, especially when it comes to certain carbohydrates, right?
Yeah.
Like, are you talking about like pastas and other things like that?
Yeah, that would be included. So anything that really changes the form if it's not a natural process. So if you simply take an avocado and squash it and turn it into guacamole, that's a pretty natural process. But if you were to take something like wheat, grind it up, add some oils, and cook it, that would be a lot more processing. So our guidance to individuals during the National Science Foundation was to only use natural kind of processed foods, squashing, changing the form with some kind of mechanical event as opposed to cooking or adding other ingredients into it. So we instructed this individual to eat food in whole form. So it would be meat and vegetables in non-processed form that he was allowed to eat. And he did that, and he had this amount of visceral fat on his baseline, meaning when he first got started.
Yeah, and so you just to describe again for the people that are listening on the podcast, you have basically a series of 6 images, and they go from week 0 all the way to week 35. So this is a sequential imagery, and the visceral fat here is this sort of yellow whitish imaging that's there. And you go week by week. You go week 0 to 2 to 5 to 15 to 25 and 35. So you sequentially see. And then next to it, you talk about how much the amount of visceral fat is. And is that in the total body, or is that in the abdomen region? Like week 0, it says 5.6 pounds. Is that the total body, or is that just in that area?
Just in the abdominal cavity. So the visceral fat would roughly include fat outside the abdomen around the heart. So that's organ fat too. And but it's quantified in this particular image through software that was captured and limited just within the abdomen. So this pinkish red color in the middle is your visceral fat. Your subcu fat is the yellow. We tracked and paid attention to the visceral fat because that is the more harmful substance.
Sorry about that. I got it wrong. The pinkish was the visceral fat.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Yeah, just adding some clarity to it. So you can see in just 2 weeks, even though you are not a radiologist, and many who are watching this and able to see that, they can visualize that the visceral fat, the pinkish substance, has been reduced. And so that's an important observation to be aware of. And that happened just by this individual cutting out processed foods. But as you rightfully point out, over 35 weeks, this guy goes from having a dad bod, he's 68 years old, and he also has muscle with fat infiltrating the muscle. We call that adverse muscle composition, or myosteatosis, the technical term for it, where fat starts depositing within the muscle of your body. And by the time 35 weeks are up, this guy goes from a dad bod to looking like a collegiate swimmer. Look, he looks like somebody in his 20s. He's reduced his visceral fat that much. And he actually improved his musculature, and he did so without any exercise. So the elimination of visceral fat was profoundly facilitated by the elimination of processed carbohydrates in food. So you asked what causes visceral fat. That's a big one. And then I don't have an image of it, but a second one we get into is alcohol. So somebody that drinks, the more you drink, and I could have you start pounding, become, this heavy drinker. We're not going to see visceral fat for a while, but the more you drink, the more your metabolism is burdened, and your capacity to have a healthy response to the caloric intake becomes compromised. So,
and is that generally because people who are drinking more are sort of also drinking their calories, right? So they're also getting just total excess extra calories, and that's contributing to visceral fat?
Well, the calories do make a contribution, but it's really more of its metabolic impact. Alcohol, when it's ingested, behaves differently because of its biochemical composition than any other forms of calories. So if you're ingesting fruit or rice or protein or meat or some other form, it's not going to have as much impact on your metabolism as alcohol. So we have our clients we recommend that they either cut back, scale back on alcohol, or completely eliminate it. And those that eliminate it completely have better results in eliminating visceral fat than those that continue to drink. And to the extent that you continue to drink, you become more resistant to the elimination of visceral fat. So somebody who comes back and has disappointing results between their scans, we will ask them about alcohol use. But for the most part, what's really interesting is people, when they get scanned, really are very, like I said earlier, very open to changing their lives more than any other time. So
because
the
they
MRI,
see it firsthand.
They do. And they say, I've never thought about giving up alcohol, but now I see that stuff inside of me, and they give up alcohol, they give up processed foods. And the third thing that causes visceral fat is impaired sleeping. So if they have a sleeping disorder, if they have obstructive sleep apnea, or they are apneic at nighttime, we bring this to attention, their visceral fat. Suddenly they get a lot more serious about using maybe their CPAP machine, or going in and getting evaluated for CPAP or obstructive sleep apnea, or they work on improving their sleep hygiene, becoming more attentive to how they may be impairing the sleep. A lot of people don't value sleep. They see this huge amount of visceral fat that they have inside of them. And so with that awareness, suddenly they start going to bed earlier. They start cutting out all the stimulation and other things. And that we could do, months of shows on sleep. But, suffice it to say that impaired sleeping has a major contribution to visceral fat. The fourth one surprises people, and it was a very interesting conversation that you had with Dr. Lustig is about stress. So stress causes, through the mediation of cortisol, the contribution and composition and deposition of visceral fat within the abdomen. And so individuals who unknowingly have stress in their lives, or who have stress in their lives but simply tolerate or put up with it, will be unfortunately accumulating unnecessarily a visceral fat inside of them, to the extent that they have it. Now, everybody's body is a little bit different, and some people respond to stress a little bit different. But to the extent that you can eliminate stress, you will eliminate the composition or deposition of visceral fat inside of people. So it's really an important discussion for people to be aware of. And then the final point that we see is, believe it or not, and and it came as a surprise, is durational exercise, where we simply exercise too much. And so we see that people that are runners, and I'll pull up a nice scan of this. Here's an MRI of somebody who's a marathoner who would run 8 to 10 marathons a year. He had a lot of this visceral fat within him, and he had this very small amount of subcutaneous fat. So we call these people with low subcutaneous fat on the outside TOFIs. So they're thin outside and fat inside. So this marathoner was filled with a lot of visceral fat. So we see, and it's probably two things. One, it contributes to visceral fat when you overexercise, and the exact mechanism is not clear. But my theory is it's probably through elevated reactive oxygen species, ROSs, that go around that are associated with exercise. If you exercise too long and too much, you enhance these ROSs from being produced. And so another example of these this happening is a really nice before and after scan, and a 58-year-old executive of a company who came in, and he was having his repeat abdominal scan, his MRI. And
so this for the audience that's listening, you have a before and after. It looks like they're taken about 2 months apart, right?
Correct.
And so on the left-hand side, for this individual that you mentioned, go ahead. You can describe it.
So on the left side is an MRI image of his abdomen, and he's got a substantial amount of visceral fat within his abdomen. His muscles look pretty good, and he was a pretty healthy guy. He was doing a lot of healthy things, 58-year-old executive. And this was a repeat itself. I don't have the MRI before it, but it was disappointing and alarming. So we asked him all the other contributions of visceral fat, and he assured us, and we were reassured by his answers, that he didn't have any of those other contributions. And here he disclosed to us that he was persisting in his running. He wasn't doing marathons. He was doing 10-mile runs 5 days a week, so 50 miles a week, which is a lot of running. As a consequence of all the running, he had a substantial amount of visceral fat that was staying there. And what visceral fat distance running appears to do is makes the elimination of visceral fat refractory. So not only does it seem to contribute to visceral fat, but when you start doing things like cutting out processed foods and sleeping better, cutting out alcohol, and then you have a harder time still getting the benefits of eliminating that visceral fat. So your body is resistant, holds on to that visceral fat more tenaciously if you're going to be doing distance running. So what we advocated and asked this guy to do was to substitute in for his distance running sprinting. And so this guy went from being a distance runner to a sprinter. And he did so in just 2 months. It was actually a little shy of 2 months. And look at the dramatic elimination of his visceral fat. So this image on the right now shows a lack of white, and he has much more dark present within his abdominal cavity. And then you can see the shape of his abdomen appears to be more oval, and he has a six-pack. And his muscles have increased. Nothing else changed in this, Dhru, other than he simply substituted distance running for sprinting. And so we've seen this in numerous individuals who eliminate distance running and substitute in sprinting.
Distance running, like marathon runners,
they just stop running. They don't do any more jogging. We recommend that they just simply do sprinting. It's a completely different form of exercise. I mean, it's hard to do. I'm a former distance runner. I ran cross country in school. I love distance running. I could not stop. I will admit to anybody in the audience today, I was addicted, in my belief. I was addicted to running. I loved it. And I loved the endorphins it produced. And I would run 70 to 90 minutes every single day. I could not stop doing this. And many people are like that. So for me, I stopped doing distance running. I started sprinting. I get my clients, patients that work with me to do the same thing, and dramatic improvement in the reduction of visceral fat when they start doing so.
So just to recap, we have the elimination of processed foods. We have the high reduction or elimination of alcohol. We have the doubling down on sleep and really making sleep one of the main focal points and prioritizations in your life. And of course, removing processed foods and greatly minimizing or removing alcohol both contribute to sleep. We have addressing the stress in our lives. And I have a few questions on that. I have a few questions on all these. And then the fifth one, which is people exercising too much, right? So let's start back up from the top. And before we get into processed foods and I get a chance to ask my clarifying questions on all of these, knowing my audience and the things that they're thinking about, remind us again, visceral fat and the elimination of it is not just about looking better. It's not just about having a more chiseled face or abdomen or other things. It's actually about reducing the amount of work that our organ systems have to do to process and function inside of the day, which is associated with longevity. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is correct. And you're wise to point that out. our lives should not just be based on our looks. You want your lives to be reflected by the quality of your life. And to the extent that you can eliminate the disease process inside your body, you're going to live better. As a consequence of that fat being eliminated, you look better. But when it comes down to the most practical aspects to selling people on health, it's not just to look better. It's so you can live better. When you live better, you can influence more people and have a more positive impact on our species, on our planet, and our time here on Earth while we're alive. So the absence of disease really is an important thing. And the presumption, unfortunately, for most people probably listening today is that the process of disease is expected to accumulate as you age. And that's not the case. It really isn't. As if you make informed choices, the majority of people are burdened today with an unnecessary amount of chronic disease. And so as they eliminate it through being enlightened about healthy lifestyle through your platform and other influencers that are doing this tremendous service to humanity to help people to become aware of both the need and how to become more healthy, we see disease processes leaving people. And so I'm passionate about the concept of challenging people that are older that they don't have to continue to have disease. They can, feel better. They can have an improved quality of life. And that is the expected course of humans that I think defied many of our older ancestors for a long period of time. And today, with all of the contributions of bad food, stress, and chemicals and toxins in our environment, and really, I think you sum it up. And I have to mention it, the microbiome being so attacked and depleted. We have just the highest amount of chronic disease we have ever seen in the history of Homo sapiens today. And it continues to worsen. And in my opinion, it is the single greatest problem facing humanity more than anything else. And the reason why I say that is because nothing reduces human productivity more than chronic disease. Nothing costs more money than chronic disease. Nothing impairs the quality of living as much as chronic disease, and nothing kills more people than chronic disease. And who is talking about the biggest problem of humanity? Nobody. So I think it's important for social influencers to be discussing this huge problem. And I'd love for anybody to correct me if there's a bigger problem, because I'll abandon this one and work on it because I'm a problem solver. But for the time being, I have launched on reversing chronic disease, and I've centered in on visceral fat and these other biomarkers that are associated with it, so that in my remaining time, while I'm on this planet and I'm alive, I want to do my part to work on the biggest problem, which is chronic disease.
Well said. Is it fair to say that generally, the more visceral fat you have, the more likelihood that you are obese? Is that generally understood, that visceral fat and excess weight or obesity have some correlation with each other?
I think that's a fair assumption that a lot of people make, but I will tell you, as a practitioner in this particular space, it is not the case. We see many people who are patently obese, who have an appearance of a large body and have very small amount of visceral fat.
Wow.
And so those individuals have a technical term, and we call them FODIes. So they're fat outside and they're thin inside.
Which means that they have a lot of subcutaneous fat.
Yes.
But they don't have visceral fat. So
Yes.
what's going on with these individuals?
Yeah, what a great question. So there's a famous model who's on Sports Illustrated magazine, and she was quite controversial. I think her name is Numi or Numa, but she was a large woman, large girl. But if you look at her face, she has a very pretty face. Now, if we were to scan her, I would be willing to bet a substantial amount of some sort of a valuable thing to me that she is abundant. She has an abundance of subcutaneous fat and a paucity of visceral fat, not much visceral fat. And so if you have more subcutaneous fat and less visceral fat, you are going to be far healthier. And this defines, anatomically, what happens, the difference between men and women. So women during their fertile years before menopause kicks in tend to lay down more subcutaneous fat than men do. So they store their energy, their fat reserves in the form of subcutaneous fat and not much visceral fat. Men are the opposite. We tend to have much more deposition of visceral fat within us. And so as a consequence of a higher ratio of visceral fat to subcutaneous fat, we suffer more disease. And so men have the capacity for having heart attacks in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Women typically do not have a heart attack until they reach their 60s because of their physiological difference that they have specifically with visceral fat being deferred until menopause. So most of their, again, fat deposition is subcutaneous fat. But once you hit menopause, if you're a woman, you start accelerating your contribution of visceral fat. And so nature is no longer conferring this protective benefit upon you when you were reproductively fertile. And now you become expendable, sort of like us guys. Males are basically genetic contributors. We just contribute DNA. But women tend to have a greater importance to our species when it comes to rearing children. And that's something that we see a lot of in multiple species. And so it's no surprise that our particular species has that. As much as we might like to share in those responsibilities, and noble as it is, from a species standpoint, nature says, women have this, we're going to protect you. But then once menopause kicks in, you lose that and you accelerate your visceral fat and you produce more visceral fat as a woman, menopausal, faster than even men do. And so an interesting exercise, if you're listening, is to go in your photographs, women, and look at your female ancestors and watch what happens to their face right around menopause at the age of 50 to 55. That's when they become less attractive and their faces take on more inflammation and they get puffier. And I'm going to hit you right between the eyes if you're listening, because I want to exploit this in women. That is when the ugly button gets pushed.
Uh-oh, you might get a lot of emails.
I know. I'm just letting you know that if you want, and most women, it's important to our species, women want to look attractive. And so when you start accelerating your visceral fat and you don't know about it, you're going to lose your appearance. And it's important to women. How you
versus
might
guys who are ugly all along because they have so much visceral fat.
I think with us guys, we're less concerned about maybe how we might look in terms of attraction, except for maybe our physiques, our musculature. But to women, their faces are important to them. And during the Renaissance period of artwork, many of the masters would paint women that were a little bit heavy, cherubic, and use them as statues, figures for statues too, because of the abundance of subcutaneous fat that they had and the estrogenic effect that would come from these fats and causing really feminine, pretty faces. And then as they get older, they lose that, and their subcutaneous fat becomes replaced, starts going away, and women get thinner legs and they get big bellies. Now, women usually premenopausal have big thighs and buttocks, and they're more fertile looking in their appearance. So please don't think I'm trying to be critical of people's appearance and use that term ugly. I'm just trying to get you to aware of, if you are concerned about your appearance, that you should be concerned about visceral fat. But it's not just appearance. It's because your appearance tells the story about visceral fat being present. And when you have a dramatic change at menopause, you should understand physiologically what is happening in your body. I would like everybody listening to be aware of visceral fat and work to eliminate it, even, throughout their whole life. But particularly when menopause kicks in, it's important for females to be aware
and I
of
think
it.
the larger component, obviously there's a lot in what you said there. One thing that we can see that's generally a societal trend in the Western world, and a hyper trend in places like Korea, is the reliance on plastic surgery as people get older.
Yeah.
And much of what they're trying to do, whether or not we agree with this or not, is a lot of people who choose to go down the path of plastic surgery, specifically these surgeries that would change the look of their face in particular, they're trying to go back towards a more youthful look. They're trying to go back more towards a look where, let's say if we're talking about women, but also some guys choose plastic surgery. In the case of women, they're trying to have their face look more like it did when they were younger. And generally as a society, right, whether we say that it's right, wrong, X, Y, and Z, there's no decision that's being said. People who go about that are trying to look more youthful. And you are sort of making the connection between youth and visceral fat. Now, also, what I've heard you say in other places is that generally, if you can avoid the rapid buildup of visceral fat, and if you can start reducing the visceral fat by focusing on these 5 things, which are important for women and men, all people, then you can actually preserve more of your youthfulness, men and women. Is that correct? Like if we look at a lot of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, or if we look at societies that are modern day sort of nomadic societies that eat a little bit more traditionally, minus the fact that most of these societies spend a lot of time in the sun. So there's sun damage that's there, right? And many of these societies too, the women that have made it that far, generally, a lot of these places, it's have as many kids until you can't have kids. I've spent time with one of these modern day nomadic groups and in Kenya, and that live on a very sort of traditional diet of milk, blood, a little bit of meat, things like that. And, the women that have survived childbirth, because obviously there's a lot of not access to health and infant mortality, and women dying in childbirth is a very super unfortunate thing, even though a lot of people are trying to work on that. They have like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids, right? So their bodies have gone through a lot. Even still, many of the women that would be in that sort of category of menopausal, their faces look a lot more youthful on average than most of the quote unquote normal people. This goes for men and women in these societies comparatively to what we see in sort of the Western world.
Yeah, it's a fair observation, a lot packed in there. So I will say that I am troubled at, I understand why women and other people attempt to improve their appearance through plastic surgery. But I would point out, as a physician and one who now specializes in health optimization, that when you change the outside appearance through some sort of a mechanical surgical event, that you're not changing your health. You're just you're changing the appearance of your face through some sort of plastic surgery. So you might feel better, and to the extent that maybe you have a more positive emotional aspect about yourself, you may derive some benefit. But what if we were to accomplish that kind of an improvement in your face by eliminating inflammatory disease that was occurring within your body, visceral fat, such as the examples I showed in my own face and that I see in other people, then you would be able to glean and exploit leverage, far more return on your investment, and eliminating that inflammatory chronic disease in your life.
For
Then if you do plastic surgery.
Yeah, we're not sort of talking about being against something. We're talking about the foundation of health that you're talking about, that true health starts from the inside out. We can't topically change our face and expect our health on the inside to change. I was more trying to save you a little bit from some of the statements that are there, that just saying that in general society, we value youth, and one way maybe people have judgments on it. Hopefully the combination would be that I don't care if people get plastic surgery. I don't care if they get Botox or other things. I just want them to be healthy on the inside. And more importantly, I just want them to feel good if they want to feel good. Eat whatever you want to, right? Do whatever you want to. But I want you to feel good, which is my guess that you want people to feel good as well.
I do. I want people to live the best quality of life and feel better. I think that's an important aspect to how you live and how you relate to other people. I mean, it's important. We are social creatures, and we're meant to interact. And so I think we're in this together, and want to have the healthiest perspective about that. So lots of improvement that we can have in terms of our approach and our ideas behind that.
So I want to go back to the Sports Illustrated model. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that would she fall into, right? We are talking about an individual. Okay, so we have the photo that's over here. People can see on Google Images. Would this person be considered overweight or obese, right? Wouldn't she be just considered overweight?
So technically, we do have a metric for obesity, and it's a body mass index of about 30. So we look at the relationship to height and weight. And anybody that hits that particular category of 30 and above, the average BMI, body mass index, is around 22. But here's the fallacy. I'm in the military. I'm still active duty in the U.S. Army National Guard. And one of the things that we pay attention to are soldiers' contribution, and we look at BMI. And so individuals that have a huge amount of weight, maybe because of muscle mass, which would be a far healthier contribution as opposed to individuals that have a lot of obesity from, say, visceral fat. They would be in very different forms of health and the ability to be mission ready and be able to functional. So the U.S. government, the U.S. military, has a vested interest in trying to have soldiers as healthy as possible, and they will separate people that have too much weight. But the question is, what kind of weight do they have? Is it muscle mass or is it inflammatory fat? So BMI is a poor metric. It is something to think about, but then you have to delve into it further and analyze what is the actual weight. What is the abundance going on, fat or muscle? And then you have to ask, like with this particular model here, Yumi, you have to ask, is it what type of fat? Does she have an abundance, or soldier have an abundance of subcutaneous fat, which has been shown in studies to be protective, versus the inflammatory fat, which is shown to be either causal or associated with chronic disease, so visceral fat. And so the MRI, ultrasound, CTs, other modalities that allow us to take a look inside the body become important to allow us to think about that. So I like to educate people on this biomarker of visceral fat, and I like to tell them that there are different ways of looking at it. MRI, I think, is the preferable way because the advantages that you get in resolution, and that the cost is the downside. MRIs are expensive. MRIs are also safer because they don't use any radiation. So some people think MRIs use radiation, but they don't. They just use magnetic fields. CTs use radiation. X-rays use radiation. DEXA scans use radiation. But there's a cost-benefit analysis to these kind of images. So if when we order an MRI, a CT, an ultrasound, any image as a physician, we have to think, does the advantages of doing this test outweigh the cost of doing it? And that's basically what insurance companies will argue against a particular test. They don't think it's worth doing. But an MRI to look at visceral fat, while it won't be supported by an insurance company, if you're listening, you should pay out of pocket to get it done because the insurance company won't fund it themselves. Doesn't mean that it's not a good test and you wouldn't benefit from doing it. So you can order these MRIs, and you would, if you're heavy and you might look like this particular model, you could have an MRI and see if, like her, you have an abundance of subcutaneous fat around your body, or do you have a lot of visceral fat? And so there are people who are very thin that would be of modest frame.
A lot of South Asians, people from my background, Indians, many of them are thin. I would have probably put myself in that category as well until I really started focusing on weightlifting, tracking calories on some aspect. I was never overweight in my life. I was always actually skinny, but my body composition was off when I looked at my total body fat and I looked at also my muscle mass. I was essentially what our friend Dr. Gabrielle Lyon says, I would have been in the category of under-muscled.
Yeah.
And also, I have had an MRI done. We'll chat about that in a minute, but I have not had one done to specifically look at my fat composition and visceral fat. I did this Pronovo scan.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Okay.
I don't know if we can pull out information from there and look at it. They don't have exact images that you can kind of hold in place and take a look at those parts of your body, like your abdomen or your heart. They just kind of give you this overlay.
Yeah.
But they're working on adding that in the future as something that people can pull in.
I'm going to be talking to them actually. So I think they're a pretty interesting company and I applaud them for what they're doing. But I'd like them to think about looking at these biomarkers for the purposes of instead of just treating disease, but to reverse it. And
what you're saying is that, and really, I also want to say this. I didn't bring up this woman to talk about her looks as an individual. We're not here to pick apart anything. This isn't a gender-based conversation of women are this or men are that. We're using this as examples and we're going through a few different things. And one of the takeaways that's there, first of all, is the reason that I brought up her, this model, who's actually very beautiful, is I was trying to get some clarity around, would she be considered overweight or obese? Because my original question was, generally, are people who are more obese have more visceral fat? And you said that largely that there's a correlation, but there are individuals that would seem, whether we use BMI or some other metric, that would be either in the overweight or potentially obese category, who actually have a lot of subcutaneous fat, right? The fat that we can kind of see and pinch and sort of jiggle on ourselves, but they potentially could have low visceral fat. And then you also have the opposite, and this is now me pointing at myself and my culture, where you have a lot of South Asians, especially in the United States, in the UK, and the Western world, who are thin on the outside. They may not have a lot of fat that you can pitch outside of their abdomen. That's one thing that you generally still see.
Yeah.
But their arms are skinny.
Yeah.
Their legs are skinny.
Yeah.
Maybe even their face is a little bit skinny. Right?
Yeah.
But they have a lot of visceral fat on the inside. So just based on how somebody looks doesn't exactly tell you how much visceral fat is going on. But if somebody has a lot of abdominal fat, that is probably one indication of them potentially having a lot of visceral fat. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. Maybe we'll just pull up this one image here that shows, I think, a pretty good example of somebody that is what we would call a TOFI. So this individual is very thin on the outside. They have a small amount of subcutaneous fat, similar to my colleague Gabe in the Army National Guard.
Yeah, they almost have a slightly oval shape, almost. Right? Almost.
And yet they have this abundance of white inside of them. So that's a huge amount of visceral fat. What's interesting is the individual, when I showed him his scan, he knew what was good and bad because we went through some good scans and some bad scans before we pulled up his. And so when it came time, Dhru, to show him his scan, he actually became so emotionally upset that he passed out. He fainted from the amount of fat that was inside of him.
Why is that? Did he think that he was healthy and then it was a shock to him?
He did. And when he woke up, he scared me. I thought he had a heart attack.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was terrified. In like seconds, I was like, God, I have no defibrillator. I have no IV. I have no epinephrine. I have no atropine. I got nothing but my hands to thump on this man's chest. I was super upset at myself that I'm having a clinic without a crash cart. And so when he came to, he was all sweaty and he woke up and I thought he was going to vomit, and his lips were trembling and his voice was trembling. And he said, cussed and, he said, you just scared basically the hell out of me. But he used a lot of expletives because he had this encounter with his inside that he had never thought about. And previously, he just looked on his outside and he was pinching the inch, pinch an inch of fat on the outside. And he had a little bit of fat on the outside. And so he thought he was good. And so, the deception that was at work in his life was that he was healthy. And he realized, and he said himself, he described himself as a fraud. He said, I realized that I have been a fraud because I have thought for most of my adult life that I've been healthy, and the scan showed otherwise. So I like to tell that story and tell people about it because you won't get the inside look from just a DEXA scan, or you won't get it from a laboratory report. I have never had a patient pass out on me from a laboratory report. I mean, it just doesn't have an emotional connection. But when I do these MRIs, it really does it's the only time, I hear the F-bomb repeatedly dropped is when I open up these MRI scans on people and they see what is going on inside their body, and it helps them to become aware of it. So TOFI is a real problem. Thin outside, fat inside.
So if you would have looked at this individual from the outside, you would have said, like, great, he generally looks healthy. He's not overweight.
Yeah, he's not obese.
Right?
He was not obese.
In fact, he could have even been maybe a little bit thin.
Yeah, he was of modest frame. He just had concentrated a maximum amount of unhealthy inflammatory tissue within his abdomen. But weight size and body, in terms of dimensions, were very similar to other people that were far healthier.
So let's talk about this person in contrast also to just the larger idea of somebody who might have a lot of subcutaneous fat, but low visceral fat. What are they doing that in this case, the quote unquote skinny person or the normal weight person has so much visceral fat, right? Going back to your list, we had processed foods, alcohol, sleep, stress, exercising too much. In the case of this gentleman that passed out and you putting his history together, what was he doing that contributed to so much visceral fat?
A lot of those things. So he ran a company, and so he was very stressed out from that. He was doing a lot of drinking. So he had a lot of alcohol use. He was not sleeping well, so he had impaired sleeping. And his diet was horrific. He would eat a lot of processed foods, a lot of social events where he'd eat a lot of carbohydrates with people. And he didn't have a lot of any distance running. He didn't have much exercise. But when he did, when he did exercise, he did a lot of sitting. He did jog, and then he did have impaired sleep. He was staying up and not sleeping well. So he had a lot of things. Women tend to be the ones that have more subcutaneous fat, and so my female clients typically will have a larger amount of subcutaneous fat and a smaller amount of subcutaneous fat. So there is, and it's worth pointing out, a difference in the type of subcutaneous fat. So if we look at this abdomen now, I'm looking at the image back of the guy I used to do running, and we're looking at his outside subcutaneous fat. And this is, I'll explain this. There's a black line that runs down through the subcutaneous compartment.
Almost on like the sort of back side of the body.
Yes. So this is the backside, and actually what we will call this as the love handles. So the love handles are this, in the posterior part, and everybody, if you reach and want to grab your love handles, you know where to reach and grab. So in this individual here, this black line is called Scarpa's fascia. So it's actually a membranous type of of material that separates the deep subcutaneous compartment from the superficial subcutaneous compartment. But I like to describe the differences between the deep and the subcutaneous fat is like the difference between bricks and clouds, because deep subcutaneous fat is like visceral fat, Dhru, because it secretes inflammatory molecules, IL-6, tumor necrosis factor, resistant, contributing to insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. And the superficial subcutaneous compartment produces a molecule. It doesn't produce inflammatory molecules. It produces a beneficial molecule called adiponectin. And it's spelled just like, it sounds, adipo, A-D-I-P-O, nectin, N-E-C-T-I-N. And if you Google it, you can read about it, and it's protective against mortality and cardiovascular disease. So basically, you want adiponectin, you want superficial subcutaneous fat, you don't want this. Now, it's interesting to me is, and I'll just admit to you, I have probably looked at this scan several hundred times. But you know what I've never noticed until right now, being on the Dhru Purohit show, is look at how he reduced his deep subcutaneous fat by sprinting.
It's like the inner layer closest to the body of the subcutaneous fat got smaller. You just saw that, and you're not even a radiologist, and you're not a physician. And I'm just noticing it for the very first time after looking at this since 2017. So yet another, ladies and gentlemen, reason to reduce your distance running and to get, now this is an N of 1. I will point out that Dhru and I just saw this together. So now I'm going to go back and look at my other scans where sprinting was introduced, and there were other confounders being not introduced, so that we can see. This was the original before and after that you brought up of the gentleman that did a lot of long distance running and then switched to sprinting. So and the improvement that he saw on the visceral fat, and also this inner layer of fat, which you call again
deep subcutaneous fat,
subcutaneous fat, which is of course a good thing that you're acknowledging.
Yeah. So I think people need to be aware. And if you've never heard about deep subcutaneous fat, don't feel bad. It's yet another thing that's not taught in medical school. And there's not a lot of discussion about it. But, I love, Dhru, that you bring out these interesting guests and interesting topics to make people aware of it. And so I think besides visceral fat, if you're following this podcast, I would call to your attention deep subcutaneous fat and become aware of it. So it's the third mention of the type of fat that we talked about. So we talked about visceral fat, we've talked about subcutaneous fat, and we've talked about deep subcutaneous fat. And one other type of fat that I mentioned earlier was myomyostosis, which is a adverse composition of your musculature. And I'll just pull up this image. Here's an example of visceral fat in an MRI, lots of white and again, little dark. So if you're watching today, you want to have, you don't want to have a lot of white and little dark. But look at the MRI scans associated with the abdominal scans. These MRI scans here on the right are his legs. So we always see a corresponding amount of fat deposited in the musculature of skeletal muscles in the legs is where I like to scan.
So just to be clear, we have a quadrant here of 4 images. The top is the before and the bottom is the after?
Well, no, they're two separate individuals. So,
okay, got it.
So the individual on the top has a lot of visceral fat, and the individual below has almost no visceral fat. Just teeny tiny little, like it's I'm pointing
both in their abdomen, but also in their legs.
In their legs. So I show two individuals, abdominal scans, and their legs, how different they are. And the abdominal images couldn't be different. I mean, the one is almost all dark. I mean, if you look at his musculature, it's just, he's wall to wall. Literally, his core is kissing his abdominis rectus, his six pack. And his back muscles are just beautiful. They're enormous. His core, his obliques, and he has no no deposition of fat within his abdominal musculature and no deposition of fat within his muscles. So to kind of hit it home for the audience, Dhru, I will describe this like filet mignon. Okay, so there's no fatty marbling in the musculature. Now, the individual on the top, his scan is replete, just filled with visceral fat in his abdominal scan, and his legs are filled with all this white streaks that I like to call human marbling. So the problem with these scans is they're both read as normal. So conventional radiology in the conventional healthcare system had nothing else to say other than that these scans are normal, and they couldn't be further from normal.
Because they don't have any abnormalities that they're looking for, like a tumor or something like that.
Yeah, but wouldn't you like to know if you had that amount of visceral fat and this amount of inflammatory fat going in your muscle? And wouldn't you also like to have the radiologist say, you know what? Like I told this guy, and you can follow him. He's on Instagram. He's Emmanuel Matadi at at Matadi, Matadi on Instagram. He had the finest abdominal scan I have ever seen in my medical career, and I have looked at a lot of them. So Matadi is one of the fastest men in the world. He's an Olympic sprinter today, and his legs are fantastically beneficial. So here's an illustration for the audience sake. Now, there are those who are listening and not watching. I have two steaks up here, and these would be familiar to most people what steaks look like. Now, the image on the left is a steak that looks very lean. There's not much fat in it. It's very red, and you might if it didn't have a shape, you might think it's filet mignon or tenderloin. But I think I eat steak all the time, but I can't tell you if that's a ribeye or New York strip. I'm guess it's probably I'm going to guess a New York strip, but whatever it is, it's grass fed. That's the point. Is this animal was fed grass and was grass fed and grass finished, and the animal on the right wasn't fed grass. It was fed an abundance of grain. Many cows never even eat grass; they just eat grain, corn, soy,
Skittles.
Yeah,
have you seen this?
Yeah, they're fed
candy,
molasses.
They're fed candy. There was a truck that overturned on its way to a feedlot. It's cheap expired candy that's used as an extra sort of fuel
and that was
source.
Exposed.
Yeah,
oh,
Tessa,
wow.
Can you look this up? Actually,
That's
we got to bring this
crazy.
up real quick.
Wow.
So yeah, red Skittles spilling onto Wisconsin highway, headed for cattle feed. So basically, all these Skittles were spilled out on the road, and then the police came, and they're like, where is all this Skittles going? Like, you guys going to a candy shop? They're like, no, this regularly happens. We take old expired candy, which is a cheap source of carbohydrates, and
I
they
don't
give
know why
them to
I would
animals.
be amazed at that. I know that we give them carbohydrates, but what's interesting is I had a client who came to me who was a veterinarian, and he informed me, and I love to share this on your podcast because I didn't know this. He said as a veterinarian, he was a farm veterinarian, so he was for cattle. He took care of large animals. He said he never was called for these animals. Never got called for them.
And when you say these, you're pointing to the healthy meat,
to the grass-fed cattle. So cows raised on grass, a species-appropriate diet. He never got called because they were healthy. And he made his money and was always called on grain-fed. So I like to make the point, that's the problem with humans today. We are not eating a species-appropriate diet. We're eating foods that are rich, processed foods, the Skittles, and it's tolerated, and it causes disease, and for us to have to go to doctors and have medical problems. So I turned myself around as a unhealthy 48-year-old physician by cutting out processed foods and eating more a species-appropriate diet, eating whole foods and eating clean, and all my medical conditions left me. And so I am now feel a responsibility to advocate awareness and teach people what isn't being taught by other physicians, the need to have healthier diets and to have a healthier lifestyle, and going beyond just diet. We've talked about sprinting, eliminating visceral fat. This animal isn't allowed to exercise. This one is. It's out in pastures, and this one's in a CAFO, confined animal feeding operation. So it's a lot less healthy.
Yeah. Can I jump in real
Sure.
quick with a question again about processed foods, which is your first category? Again, eliminating or greatly reducing processed foods in the diet. I think most people that come on this podcast talk about that. Here you are taking these things, processed foods, eliminating, removing alcohol, really doubling down on sleep, talking about the stress component and making sure that we have stress solutions in our life and reducing excess sources of stress in our life. And then last one is not exercising too much, which a ton of questions on that too. So on the processed food side, right? The question that I want to ask you is, we already talked about the fact that you can have somebody who has a lot of subcutaneous fat, but still can be healthy. And you can have somebody who doesn't have a lot of subcutaneous fat, but could be very unhealthy because they have a lot of visceral fat. And we talked about the gentleman who had a lot of visceral fat, but you looked at him and you might have even thought that this person was healthy or maybe even skinny, right? And a lot of people think, oh, I want to look like that. I would love to, look that way. But they didn't realize that he has a lot of visceral fat until he came in for your MRI and he passed out, right?
Yeah.
So question for you, for the individual that is on the outside, they look overweight, maybe even obese, but they have low visceral fat, right? Which again, for everybody following along, that's a good thing, low visceral fat. In an ideal world, you have low subcutaneous fat and you have low visceral fat, right? That's like in an ideal world.
Correct.
But for those that are in that category that have a lot of subcutaneous fat, which would put them at overweight or obese, but low visceral fat, what's going on with them? Do they have some sort of genetic anomaly, or is it that they're generally staying away from processed foods? They're generally staying away from alcohol. Their sleep is pretty good. Maybe their stress, they're not exercising too much in the way that you defined it, but they're still eating excess calories.
Yes.
So their excess calories is contributing to weight gain, excess weight, more than what their body might need in their sort of base metabolism. So the body has to do something with it. Right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that is the idea. And I think people that are assuming too much, they're living too abundantly and eating too many foods, have a too large amount of subcutaneous fat. So there's the Goldilocks principle when it comes to subcutaneous fat. You want to have just enough to show, hey, I'm living well. I have a small reserve that will allow me to have an energy reserve, but I'm not carrying too much subcutaneous fat that my ability to run and defend myself isn't being impaired. So I would submit, if you're listening, you're a bodybuilder, that you don't want to have a paucity or complete elimination of your superficial subcutaneous fat. You want a thin layer of it. And unfortunately, bodybuilding isn't really a sport of health. It's a competition where you reveal musculature, large amounts of muscle with the highest amount of definition. So they compete to eliminate subcutaneous fat. And unfortunately, that's not the healthiest objective for a sport to have. And they are ignorant or unaware of, I should say, is a nicer way of saying, visceral fat's potential contribution. So the MRI with regard to people that are very thin on the outside in terms of their subcutaneous fat, but may have an abundance of musculature, could reveal for a competitive bodybuilder the fact that belying that is a large amount of inflammatory disease-causing visceral fat. And so many bodybuilders have inflamed looking faces as they continue to age and compete. They have larger amounts of visceral fat accumulating, usually unknowingly, inside of them, and smaller amounts of subcutaneous fat. You see a lot of definition, so it's not a healthy situation. But in their muscles too, I would love to have a bodybuilder, and this image here I'm pointing to shows scans through the legs of an individual who's 40 years old at the top, and they have no fatty infiltrates in their skeletal muscle, so they don't have human marbling. And an image below is a 74-year-old that has the same condition. I just scanned a client of mine who's 78 and has the same kind of legs, no fatty infiltrates. They've been very healthy and doing the strategies I shared with them. And this individual who's 74 here has visceral fat, fatty infiltrates in their legs. Their leg muscles are shriveling up from sarcopenia, and they have basically an abundance of fat within their legs. So
a lot of fat, very little muscle.
Yeah.
And here you're showing that no matter what age you are, you literally have an MRI scan of a 74-year-old that looks the same, if not even maybe a little bit better than the scan of a 40-year-old.
Correct.
But generally, they look the same.
They do.
So this is how visceral fat and the reduction of it and reducing the internal marbling of you at any age can make you younger from the inside out.
Correct. And again, this association of visceral fat to these muscles, and returning the images, the MRI with a lot of visceral fat and how much fatty infiltrates in the skeletal muscles of the legs are important, because just recently in the past 3 months, AI discovered through artificial intelligence and analysis of multiple studies that this adverse muscle composition, or myosteatosis, fat within the skeletal muscle system, doubles your mortality for cardiovascular disease. And yet that has been unknown and never shared with doctors. So, Dhru, we have physicians doing CTs and MRIs, probably hundreds of thousands of them a day are being done, and they're completely ignoring this. And so you're having these scans and nobody is bringing it to your attention that you have this dangerous fat being deposited within your legs and your arms. So these are done generally for joints and things, but the muscles are there to be seen. And I just find it inexplicable.
You're
that
speechless.
Physicians, I'm speechless. I can't even get it out. That physicians aren't aware and don't bring this to your attention. So that's
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So I think that's an important statement, right? You said that people who have more internal marbling, which means more visceral fat, and you're showing an image on the screen over here, it doubles their risk of cardiovascular disease, right? Now, is that because of a correlative aspect that generally the more internal marbling you have, the more damaging you have to your heart, you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, you're probably drinking more alcohol, you have more stress? Or is there a direct connection to the fat and that there are excess soft plaque deposits inside of the arteries? Like, what's the connection there between the internal marbling? Because you're showing the legs, but you're also saying that they have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Yes. So what's the connection?
So good. So there are 3 types of muscles within the body, and we had to learn these in medical school. And the 3 muscles are skeletal muscle, there's cardiac muscle, which is your heart, and the 3rd type is smooth muscle. So smooth muscle line the walls, and they're the largest part of an artery, a vein, or a cardiovascular structure, some sort of vascular structure. The largest portion of it, the real estate, is taken up by smooth muscle. And so what I think is happening, I don't know, is the smooth muscle is also having deposited within it inflammatory fat that is compromising it. So as I eliminated my visceral fat, my image now, we're looking at a before and after photograph of myself, an image on the left and an image on the right. I eliminated my visceral fat, and I have, on the image on the right, dramatically improved vasculature. And so you can see more prominent on my hand. My veins are more plump, and the blood return, the important part of veins are they return blood that is poorly oxygenated and have less nutrient value from the tissues back to the heart, where they can be reoxygenated, and to the gastrointestinal system, where they can pick up nutritional benefits. So my vasculature is very poor on the left, but also notice correspondingly that my muscle tone is very poor in my arms compared to the second image on the right.
The after image.
Yeah, the after, exactly. And then look at my protruding abdomen. So this is the abdomen of a typical 50-year-old, maybe a 45-year-old has this. And look at the angle. There's a point right here where I'm pointing to, which is basically at the belly button. And that's the most protuberant point anteriorly. So it's sticking out. Now, look at my abdomen here. I've got a flat abdomen, and this is the abdomen, the shape of basically somebody who is 16 to 20, a flat abdomen. And so what happens is the inflammatory effect of visceral fat literally is causing the muscles to decrease its performance. So it can't hold in your guts. And so my intestines now are more functionally withheld within my abdominal cavity versus here, they're not, and they're protruding out. And look at the dramatic change overall as my blood improved. I have much better improved looking skin. My profile is healthier. I don't know how the shape of my head changed so much, but it really did. And then my skeletal system, my posture is significantly improved, from improved blood flow. So when it comes to real estate, it's location, location, location. When it comes to health, it's blood flow, blood flow, blood flow. And then as we eliminated that visceral fat, we saw within the arteries of individuals, and now I'm looking at two images of a before and after of our arteries within the brain. This is called the circle Willis. And these
is this an MRI or is this a different?
This is an MRI. And we see that in the individual that was running 10 miles a day, 50 miles a week, the 58-year-old that cut out distance running, started sprinting, these are his arteries. And we see here diminished blood flow. So the arteries that have dark flow here is where the blood is flowing good. There's a little bit of a plaque here at this location here in the middle cerebral artery. And then you see haziness distally to that where there's not as much blood flow. But on the left side, we see and I say left because anatomically that is his left artery. He's laying down and his head's up here and his feet are towards us. So if the audience is saying, well, Sean Omer is dyslexic, and I am, by the way, but I do have my anatomy correct. And this is a left MCA lesion. So he has a big plaque here that is impairing blood flow, and we can see it's poor in the segment distally to it. But the take-home point here, Dhru, is in 9 months, well, this artery opened up here on this side, and the plaque was reversed here in the image on the right. So
wow.
In 9 months,
so he healed his lesion.
He did indeed, and these were just from his participation in the study with the National Science Foundation to cut out processed foods, to do maximum intensity exercise like sprinting instead of distance running, to eat food in whole form, to sleep better, reduce stress, and to use a sauna about 20 minutes, 4 to 7 times.
That was part of the protocol
week.
In the study?
Yes, we recommend it. Not everybody was able to do it. The interesting thing about the study, and people are critical of it because they say, well, it was 6,000 people. And lots of people, lots of researchers would want to have the study results studied and peer-reviewed and over a long period of time. But here's what we did. I remember during this time when we were doing this, we got this grant from the National Science Foundation. They flew with my partner and I down to Washington, D.C. We were very excited. And they had a Google executive there. And he was sharing some of their moonshot projects, some of the exciting things they did. And one of the things that Google did was to ask the question, how quickly can you get to your first prototype and start making changes? If you want to change and bring disruption in a beneficial way through technology and application, you can't afford to have long, extensive research. And I think we're having problems in medical research because that's what we do. So what we did was, let's scan people and see the difference between walking and sprinting or sprinting and running. Instead of doing a study for a year and a half, looking at 10,000 people at that, let's just study 5-10 people and look at it quickly and see which ones are getting it. We just kept scanning them very quickly. So we got these insights that told us sprinters do better than runners. And walkers do better than sitters. And people that eat processed foods have visceral fat in 2 days. We could see it. Versus people that eat, healthy meats and healthy vegetables didn't get that. People that stayed up and studied and didn't sleep, we could see that impact in visceral fat. So we did a series basically of lots of little tiny mini studies. And it's not going to get published in JAMA because we don't have large numbers over a long period of time. But we developed a lot of expertise, and now I can help to influence other researchers. They could go on and do those more extensive studies and use a larger number of periods over a period of time. But our purpose was to try to develop biomarkers for the National Science Foundation for the purposes of helping our country to reverse chronic disease and then to make money out of it. And that's something that's really important. If you cannot make money out of something, Dhru, you cannot get it impacted into society. Money drives the wheels of commerce. It's what delivers care and service to humanity. And if you can't make money on something, nobody's going to buy it. Nobody's going to sell it.
So this would be considered more of like a proof of concept study. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
So in research, there's regularly proof of concept studies just to kind of say, hey, is there something here?
Yeah.
And many of the big studies that we see out there in different categories, gut microbiome, other stuff, if you trace the history, and many of the past guests that we've had on the podcast here, almost all things, start off with some proof of concept study, right? That doesn't mean that it's ready for publishing and peer review. It's just to show initial enthusiasm that something could be here. And then maybe those researchers go further or they pass the baton on to somebody else.
Exactly.
So that was what you guys were doing here.
Yes, that's what we were intending to do. And so I think many of our protocols and what we saw in this during this period of time represent rich future studies that we could look at larger numbers of people and watch. Like just these cerebral arteries, we only started scanning them, Dhru, because people were self-reporting to us that they were more intelligent, their memories were improving, and they were more than just reporting it. They were questioning in a very kind of, I'll be honest with you, irritating way to us, asking us why their memories were improving. What was it about visceral fat that allowed them to become more intelligent and improve their memory? And so out of 6,000 abdominal scans, people that were scanning, we only did about 20 brains because it happened towards the end of the study. And that's where we picked up these arteries had lesions that were reversing. And then during this time, you probably don't have an number of resolution, but I have visible pulses now throughout my body.
You can see in your veins pulsing.
Yeah, it's really my artery that's pulsating. And as a consequence, my arterial sites are now visible all over my body. If I lay down here, maybe at a podcast, I'll show you, my belly goes up and down with my aorta. Now, that's good. You want to see blood flow, going through your structures. Now, I call it today my human dashboard. It's this visible signs of things that you can track. So for instance, when I go out in the sunshine and I have my patients go out in the sunshine with visible pulses that they acquire when they get rid of visceral fat, they eventually get visible pulses. When they go out and sunshine hits their skin, their endothelial cells start producing nitric oxide and their pulses are enhanced, not the rate, but the magnitude of blood flow, the strength, or you could better describe as the amount of blood coursing through. So the amount of blood being delivered to those tissues is enhanced. Doesn't that sound, ladies and gentlemen, like a good thing? Don't you want more blood flow to your tissues? So if you go out in the sun and you see these pulses become enlarged, not just faster, but enlarged, you reinforce the benefit of going out in the sun. This also happens when you sprint rather than just run. You see an enlargement and engorgement of that blood. When you use a sauna, you see the same thing happen as well. And the fourth strategy we see is fasting. So when somebody does an extended fasting, their blood flow improves. So why is that beneficial is, well, it's like driving a car. You need to glance at your dashboard to see where you go to facilitate safe and efficient, maximally efficient, effective operation of the vehicle. We have lost this, Dhru. We have lost our ability to glance at our bodies and derive that feedback that we need to optimize and reinforce what we're supposed to be doing. So I think visible pulses are should be included as biometrics in addition to visceral fat, and also the appearance of skin. There's another interesting. I will do it here. Turgor, where you pull your skin up on the back of your hand and it snaps back.
Skin elasticity test.
Yeah, well, they call it elasticity, and they say it's from collagen. A lack of collagen, older people. But you know what happens if you go out in the sunshine? Before you go out and you do that test, it will be slower, and then you go out in the sun, it will snap back faster because of nitric oxide. So sunshine is, unfortunately, I think, demonized today. We're warned not to go out in the sunshine, and I know that it has the potential for causing harm, but I think it's in people that are more vulnerable, that are less healthy, that harmful effect of sun exposure is more problematic. But the healthier you are, the greater capacity you have to exploit and leverage the sun. So skin turgor, elasticity, visible pulses, your nail beds, how well perfused your nail beds are. They should be nice and pink. And your toenails should be nice and pink, reflecting adequate perfusion. Our Chinese counterparts in Chinese medicine say that humans die from our feet first. And so very often, because it's the tissue furthest from the heart to actually perfuse, you see yellowing and thickening and disease going on within the nails and toes. And you think about an 80 or 90-year-old's typical foot, it's an unattractive, unhealthy appendage. But it doesn't have to be. If the 80 or 9-year-old lives a healthy life, they can deliver blood flow to those tissues, and they should have nice translucent toenails, and fingernails should also be the equivalent on the hand. And toenails should not be yellow, should not be thickened. They should not be infected with onychomycosis from fungal and yeast particle and invasion and infection. And your feet, your toes, should tell the story of how healthy you are, because it also tells the story. It corresponds to your body and to your face. So health is systemic, and you can look at any part of the body, and it will tell the story on how healthy somebody is. And so you can chase a particular disease that might be in one particular area, but chronic disease affects your whole body.
Going back to this brain image that you have here, and also connecting it to these other proxies of health, you're talking about our nails, our feet. Part of the takeaway that I'm getting, which again goes to your larger point, and I might have missed something in it, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that generally the more visceral fat you have, the harder it is for all your body's systems to do their job. So in this instance where you had some lesions in the brain, are you saying that there's actual visceral fat deposits in the brain that are preventing accurate blood flow? Is that accurate?
I wouldn't describe it as visceral fat. I'd call it as, and again, it's my hypothesis that when fat is being deposited in skeletal muscle, it's also being deposited within the smooth muscle of the arteries to the extent that visceral fat is present within those abdomen. So, but here's an interesting picture. These two faces here.
So this is a before and after of a young man.
Yeah. So it's a client patient. And how long do you think it is between the before photograph and the after photograph to have this amount of improvement in their face?
So on the right side, his face looks like the after photo. His face looks more chiseled, more sort of vibrant. Looks like could be the shadowing or other stuff, but generally looks healthier on the right side. And on the left side, his face, I would say, just generally overall looks more puffier.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's probably going to be less than what I said, but what is this, 3 weeks?
3 days.
Wow. So in 3 days, somebody is seeing a dramatic improvement in the puffiness of their face.
Yeah. So these photographs, I collect photographs a lot because I'm doing AI to look at photographs, an interesting project. This individual improved their face so much in 3 days. And what they did was, for the sake of the audience, they said, well, I'd like my face to improve that much. They did a 72-hour fast. So they ate no calories for 72 hours. Now, if you're listening, don't expect that that's going to happen to your face in 72 hours. What happened, and the reason, to explain this profound effect, is that this individual on the left had no visceral fat. They had eliminated, they'd seen me about 7 months before, had eliminated their visceral fat, and then did a 72-hour fast. So a 16-year-old, a 20-year-old who has very little visceral fat, who does a 72-hour fast, will have that kind of a change in their face by eliminating their visceral fat, versus a 70-year-old filled with visceral fat who just tries to do the same fast. They won't get that kind of benefit. So
yeah, and just to be clear, you're not recommending that the first step for people is a 72-hour fast.
Not at all.
And you're not saying that everybody all of a sudden is going to benefit from a 72-hour fast. You're simply articulating what?
What? So the point I'm trying to make is that visceral fat, anecdotally, appears to reduce the benefit that you get from a lot of healthy practices. In other words, the amount of visceral fat you have, we have found, impairs your body's ability to respond to the signal. So there's a paradigm called stimulus impacts an organism, the organism responds. And an example of that is lifting weights. So when you lift weights, it's a stimulus. The impact on the organism causes a response, which is muscle hypertrophy. Well, the amount of visceral fat you have dictates the level of health in that organism and the response is produced. So the best explanation for why a 70-year-old male who lifts weights does not produce as much muscle in response is because the 70-year-old has impaired their health by the accumulation of visceral fat, chronic disease. But what if the 70-year-old eliminated their visceral fat? So I unfortunately don't have pictures of this myself, but I have photographs of myself without a shirt on, age 55, and then a photograph of myself at age 59 or 60. I'm 60 today. And I have dramatic increase in my musculature. And people a lot of times challenge me. They think I do steroids or hormones or testosterone replacement or something, performance-enhancing drugs. No, I simply have eliminated my visceral fat. So what happens as you get rid of visceral fat, it basically realigns you to a more youthful, and I would say more healthy response system. And so when you have a stimulus, you can respond better. So in other words, the point I'm trying to make is visceral fat acts as an impedance or a governor on your ability to become more healthy. So you want to eliminate that visceral fat, that inflammatory substance inside of you. So as you start doing things like lifting weights, walking, sprinting, doing a sauna, you can accelerate and enhance your body's response. So the example I give to clients is my 17-year-old son, Aiden, and you, Mr. Client, patient who's 6 years old, if you lift the same weights, the same sets and same repetition, the same amount as Aiden, and you do that for 6 months downstairs in my weight room, you will have less results than Aiden. And the biological explanation is not age. It's the fact that Aiden has not destroyed his physiology from inflammatory chronic disease, largely coming from visceral fat, and you have. But we see clients and humans that are older now eliminate visceral fat and then start getting muscle gains, start changing the face, the shape of their face, start getting visible pulses. The quality of their life is improving. Yes, their appearance improves, but your point is spot on. We do these things so that we live better, not to look better. If our goal was to look better, we would do plastic surgery, buy clothes, and what I describe that as kind of the Earl Scheib paint job. You just do a paint job on the outside of a car, but the car does not run any better. You want a well-running car that is going to serve your needs, carry you through, and help you to enjoy as much as you can every circumstance that you will face in the future, whether you'll benefit from it or suffer from it, is guided the most by the health of your body.
Is it fair to say in the case of your son, right? Or when you were 17 or when I was 17, generally, yes, we have less visceral fat, but also we have more, growth hormone inside of our body. We have more stem cell production inside of our body. So there are a few other things. Visceral fat is important too, but there are a few other things that might be going on at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. But here's what I'd pause it with.
Please.
What happens to those people that are in their 50s and 60s that haven't accumulated that visceral fat or who eliminate it? Do they start getting more stem cells? Do they start getting more hormones? So let's take a look at this picture here. Let's look at these two legs. So this is a picture of my leg on the left and my leg on the right as I develop visible pulses, eliminate visceral fat. Look at the tremendous increase in the hair on my legs. Estimated by a hair surgeon, this is not an area of expertise I have, to be about 300% increase. So my explanation of this is that better blood flow to the stem cells around the follicles allowed for greater increase in hair. The hair started growing again when
So
I
you're
had
saying
a
the
very
right
positive.
side is the after.
Yes.
After you doing sprints and
Yes.
all of the changes you
Yeah.
mentioned.
There's quite a few of
You're
things
seeing an
involved.
explosion in hair.
Yes.
It's a little tough to see because the one on the right is a different color configuration, but generally you can see that there's more hair that's there. And so you noticed an explosion of hair growth.
Yes. And we see this in client patients as they eliminate visceral fat. They get, in particular, visible pulses, which would indicate better blood flow to those tissues, that their hair on their legs. Now, the absence of those changes, in other words, people who are not getting rid of visceral fat and not improving their blood flow, the projected and natural state of the skin is to be glabrous, to lose hair. So if you think about a 90-year-old laying in a bed, they have very little hair on their legs and their arms, and oftentimes to the top of their head, because it's not just aging, but more effect of impaired physiology, less beneficial hormones, more stem cell death. And so the question I like to ask is it possible that we could, and by eliminating on a widespread basis visceral fat and improve blood flow, could we see alopecia, male pattern baldness improve? And there's an interesting study that shows a correlation between heart fat and alopecia. This is an example of cardiac fat. So we have two MRIs here, and the image on the left shows two right and left lungs. In the middle of your lungs is your heart. And fat shows up, as we mentioned earlier, as white on an MRI. And there's a large amount of heart fat in this particular image. And this is the guy who just cut out processed foods and didn't exercise for 1 minute. And look at how much he reduced his cardiac fat in the course of just 13 weeks. So heart fat is inflammatory. It has a local effect right on the arteries on the outside of the heart. Coronary arteries transit on the outside of the heart, and they're, for that reason, advantageous to a cardiothoracic surgeon who could access them more easily without cutting into the heart. and to do a transplant. But in autopsies and studies, we've seen people where the artery has an unusual course, Dhru, where it goes into the muscle of the heart, and it's it's interposed between the artery is muscle and then that cardiac fat, cardial fat. That segment where it dives down has segmental sparing from atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So that heart fat has a local inflammatory effect and contributing to, at least in studies where it's been done, segmental disease. So heart fat is a bad player. Fortunately, we saw in all our 6,000 clients that when we looked at visceral fat, that those that we also scanned the hearts and we didn't do as many scans of the heart as we did abdomens. The cardial fat, the fat around the heart, is reduced as well as you get rid of that visceral fat. So a nice example, Asif, my friend who's so nice to want to help the Bangladesh poor kids get educated like he's been educated in America. This was his what's called a sagittal view. So we're taking a slice up and down. This is his head, and Asif's feet are down here. This is his belly, and these are his backs. This is his kidney. And right above his abdomen is his heart. Now, look at the large amounts of fat within his mediastinal region surrounding his heart, this inflammatory
fat. Almost looks
fat.
like a little glove or mitten around his heart.
Yes.
A glove of visceral fat.
Surrounding it. So corresponding to, we always see visceral fat is to heart fat. So again, it's this consistent story that visceral fat and chronic disease is systemic. It's not specific to just one particular area of the body. When we bother to look at the sinister effect of chronic disease, we see it all over.
Just a couple more questions about sort of your journey in your body, right? What would you estimate? Because visceral fat, again, is taking us out of the idea of like BMI. There's people at all different levels of BMI, people that look skinny, people that look overweight or even obese, that may have a lot of visceral fat or may not have that. What would you estimate, though, your body composition on doing like an in-body scan or a DEXA scan or one of the traditional ones? What would you say your body composition is? And is there a total amount of visceral fat, volume of visceral fat in the body that is generally our target goal that we want to stay under?
Yeah, great question. So the first part is I do use a body impedance scale. So I give my clients a cheap $20 scale that I get off Amazon. And I give it to them not for the accuracy of the readings, but to follow the trend. So generally, bioimpedance is another form that you can look at visceral fat, but you're never going to get a direct measurement of visceral fat from bioimpedance. It's a calculated measurement based on muscle and fat that it's more accurately able to determine. So as you lose body weight and you're losing fat, they extrapolate from it based on averaging how much visceral fat probably is being lost. So my clients who lose visceral fat, there's a wide degree of variance in bioimpedance between the reported amount of visceral fat lost in a scale. It's usually not as much as what is really lost when we do an MRI, based on our focal strategies to eliminate that visceral fat. So bioimpedance is a helpful modality for tracking trends, but it is not accurate. If you think you're going to get a good reading of how much muscle and subcutaneous fat you have and visceral fat from a $20 bioimpedance scale or a $60 bioimpedance evaluation in some fancy club, you're going to be disappointed or not. You're going to be misled. You really want to spend, your time and effort, money on getting an MRI, which runs about $500. And then to your question about or up to $1,000. Your question about the amount of visceral fat, I do get that a lot. You want none. I mean, ideally, you don't want any of this inflammatory fat within you. You want to live as stress-free life as possible. You don't want to be drinking alcohol and impacting your metabolism.
There's not sorry to interrupt, but there's not like a Goldilocks approach when it comes to visceral fat. I mean, there's a reason that our body produces it. Is there not some protective benefit to having a tiny bit?
I've never seen it. It isn't. People think that it has a protective benefit. Your body produces it because it's the first earliest expression of things gone wrong. We saw it in children. Kids get visceral fat early on, unhealthy kids, and healthier children don't have it.
Like
and that continues.
Have
none. I've some healthy kids have no visceral fat, and I have some clients that bring their children to me, and they're filled with visceral fat early on. And so it really turns on the lifestyle that you're living, whether you're an adult or a child. And you can stress out a child. You can, unfortunately, I don't have any examples of kids with alcohol consumption, but I'm quite sure if you started, that would be a ridiculous study. If that was happening, kids were, and I suppose that there are kids globally that get into alcohol use at a young age, but impaired sleep and lots of processed carbs will cause these deposition of this inflammatory substance. So no, you want none. You want to eliminate it. I think it's hard. I mean, if you're going to ask me how realistic is it to, I think is probably the more practical question, how realistic is it to completely eliminate all your visceral fat? It's very hard. I have seen clients that have worked extremely hard get their visceral fat down to around probably 4 ounces. I mean, that's a shocking amount.
Is it the lowest you've ever seen in your scan? Is somebody that has that amount?
Yeah, I would say about four. Yeah.
And so for somebody like yourself, do you have any estimation about, not that this is the goal for everybody, but just to give a reference range? Like, how much visceral fat do you have in your body?
Perfect question. So we wrote software in my first startup that was proprietary to evaluate visceral fat. You can, by the way, there is free visceral software to evaluate and quantify visceral fat out there. So it's open source, and you're able to get that if you're involved in MRI and technology. You can get that, and it's freely available to you. The interesting thing is, we stopped using it because we never found a number helpful. And when we would tell people, as you remember some of the images we had up there earlier, quantified the visceral fat, the number didn't seem to influence people as much as visualizing their visceral fat. So to answer your question, I probably have probably around 8 to maybe 12 ounces of visceral fat within my latest scan of my abdomen. But what I track is visualizing it rather than quantifying it, because it's the visualization of that unhealthy expression of tissue within your body that's going to impair you more and affect you more and allow you to change than some number. Otherwise, it becomes sort of like a laboratory study. And it's people that look at that visceral fat that change their life more than if I were to give them just a scan and quantified it without allowing them to see it. So everybody, and by the way, there's studies on this too, Dhru. Recently, in the past 3 years, a study showed that doctors, for all pathology, that take patients and show them pathology inside their body via CT or an MRI or even X-ray, have a greater impact in being able to meaningfully treat and help somebody than if they just gave them the report. So, we are creatures with senses, and to the extent that we engage our senses, we learn better. Smell, touch, feel, sight, all of the senses, the ability to educate us and inform us and to be more effective in our world allow us to do so through the senses better than if we just looked at a number. So when it comes to health, you really want to engage as much as possible the senses in interpreting the data and whatever information you're looking at.
So I'm sure you're aware of all the different nutritional debates that are out there. One of the landscapes of one debate is that there are people that are traditionally described as individuals that believe that, everything is sort of energy balance, right? The calories in, the calories out. Generally, most people that come on my podcast and the people that I look up to, they would say, hey, listen, yes, total calories does matter, right? You can overeat and gain weight, just like we were talking about the sort of healthy fat people that are still consuming excess calories, but quality of calories matters more, but that doesn't mean that you can't write off total calories, right? So like they say that still total calories matter, but quality of calories. Now, part of what I'm hearing you say is that even when controlled for calories, let's say we had one group of people who is basically staying away from all processed foods in the way that you describe it, right? Kind of like the diet that you follow right now. They're not eating processed carbohydrates or other things. Generally, they're eating vegetables. You in particular do a lot of fermented, not a lot of them, but the vegetables that you have, you choose to have them fermented.
Correct.
But you generally find vegetables are part of a healthy diet, right?
I do.
That's recommended out there. You get probably most of your calories from meat and animal products. Would you say in terms of total calories, they come from there?
Correct.
But again, your larger approach that you're sharing with your patients is stick to whole foods, right? And if you're going to process, you're really saying like a mechanical, like a blending or a mixing or other stuff, not a deeper refining of foods that are out there, which would include a lot of like the more processed. And then eventually on the higher end of it, everybody generally agrees, like, let's stay away from ultra processed foods. So what I feel like I'm hearing you say is that if you had two groups of people, one group of people, even if calories were equated in both groups, one group of people is sticking to your definition of non-processed foods, whole foods, their diet, and also staying away from alcohol. Of course, the other lifestyle factors are there too, prioritizing sleep, not having an abundance of stress in our life. And then, of course, you're not exercising too much and you have some version of healthy exercise, which we're going to break down in a second. Then you have this other group that is eating still adequate level of protein, is having an adequate level of fiber, is still being controlled for calories. So both groups have their proper calories. But in this group B, the difference would be is that this group B is having some degree of processed foods as a regular part of their diet, right? But they're still meeting their protein goals and they're still meeting their fiber goals. What I'm hearing you say is that you would suspect that group B, even when equated for calories, even when equated for sleep and stress and exercise in both groups being the same, you feel that group B is going to have more visceral fat. Is that accurate?
I do. I think that is the case. And I'd also extend it more than just to visceral fat. I would say that the group B would be less healthy. And so I would ascribe to the group of people that are not in the calories in, calorie out, strict application of caloric intake. I say the quality of the calorie is more important than the quantity of the calorie. And I would add in a further amplification or fidelity to the point about quality and say that it is likely explained, I'm quite confidently, by the difference in the microbiome of the individual. In other words, the healthier somebody's microbiome is, there reflects their capacity for caloric intake and processing of foods. So, for instance, there are people that have a healthier microbiome, a different collection of microbes, who could eat even unhealthy processed foods, very sugary processed foods like cotton candy, and not have the degree of impact either in visceral fats or in some sort of detrimental health consequence. And so the microbiome represents an area of importance for us to study and potentially leverage and utilize as ways of potentially treating or improving humans. An interesting study came out probably about 7 years ago, where they gave people brownies with icing on them, and they studied these individuals' blood sugar response. And what they found is certain people were able to eat those ice brownies without any impact in their blood sugar. And what was determined in those individuals was specific shared microbes that they alone had, that other individuals whose blood sugars went up did not have. And so there was active research to try to turn that particular species of microbes into a supplement that you could give people that would allow them to eat chocolate ice brownies. I got to imagine that there's other harmful effects besides just, blood sugar going up. But nonetheless, if they're reasoning, trying to figure out a probiotic supplement that would allow to do that. But these microbes work better in vivo than they do in vitro, and they're very delicate. So I'm not sure that anytime soon they're going to be able to come up with that. But the bigger point is, the healthier your microbiome, the healthier you are, and the healthier you live your life in terms of diet, lifestyle choices that you do, how you exercise, how you sleep, how much stress you put up with, influences and dictates your microbiome. Even your behavior, your interaction with other people, all go towards, the level of health of your microbiome. So I like to share on podcasts and within my client patients the need to live the healthiest life possible by making the best choices. And it comes down to this: you want to have the healthiest collection and diverse collection of microbes, beneficial microbes that you can possibly get, and the fewest amount of detrimental microbes in you and on your body that you can possibly try to objectify and pursue. So it's an area of poor understanding. Lots of people don't understand the microbiome, haven't been taught about it. It's not from a scientific standpoint well understood even by researchers. I mean, we are just scratching the surface and understanding the collection of the microbiome. There's somewhere between 50 and 70, maybe even more, a trillion microbes that live within our gut. We only have 10 trillion cells about in our body. So it's fair to distinguish between ourselves and these microbes, that we are more other organisms than we are ourselves. And yet I will say, having talked so much about visceral fat, that nothing is more important to your health and influencing your health than your microbiome. But the visceral fat, there is no better target to study and work with, and nothing will improve your health more than tracking visceral fat and eliminating it from your body.
Now, with the gut microbiome, we've had on individuals like Dr. Emran Mayer, who's one of the earliest researchers in this space. He's at UCLA, has a whole department and division in school that he's set up on it. And we've had other individuals like Zach Bush, who I've heard you talk about as well before.
Love Zach.
Generally speaking, most of the people that are in the space of gut microbiome research, and even like the American Gut Project, would say that a couple of things that we do know are diversity of plant foods seem to be associated with diversity of gut microbiome, as well as fiber and total quantity of fiber in those target ranges that are there. I think the average American gets less than 15 grams of fiber a day. And I think that the target recommendations, actually, I'll have to look it up in terms of what's recommended. How do you feel about those recommendations?
Well, I used to ascribe to them, and they seem very sensible. But, there's conflicting data. A recent study came out and showed that the amount of fiber and that was added to an individual's diet with impact on the microbiome showed higher levels, or I should say, no change in their markers of inflammation. and that there were actually in individuals that eliminated the fiber, they actually had lowering levels of markers of inflammation in a particular study. However, it was small. And so I was surprised by that. And I think we just need larger studies. And it may be that you want to, I'm just going to posit it, as a serious researcher, it might be the case that you want more higher quality microbes, a greater abundance of higher quality microbes than a sheer diversity, because maybe that diversity brings in less beneficial microbes. It's possible that you're bringing in a larger amount of less favorable microbes. But I do tell my clients that they want a larger collection of diversity. I really do. And I tell them for that purpose to eat a variety of fermented foods. I tell them to go out and, I say a good client patient goes out and buys 20 jars of ferments. An average client patient goes out and buys, 4 to 5. And a client patient that is not very motivated and has poor results buys 1 jar. And so when it comes to the microbiome, I tell my clients, when you eat fermented foods, you want to think about Noah's Ark, small quantities of a variety of foods. And so I do generally feel that is helpful guidance, but I remain very open-minded to the possibility that maybe less diversity and more abundance of truly beneficial microbes are what we might find out in the future is most helpful for humans.
So one other question about this whole landscape of how to navigate this context of processed foods, then I'd love to go through alcohol, sleep, stress, and exercise to leave people with some practical recommendations for each. So one of the criticisms that is often given to the world of wellness, which obviously is everything lumped in. It's plant-based diets, it's carnivore, it's people in between, it's the Mediterranean diet, is that the more restrictive you make a diet, the harder it is for people to follow. And I think that's been shown in multiple long-term studies that people reference. So if we tell people to not eat, and we have them shoot for eating no processed foods, like only eat a diet like a Whole30 diet, which is generally how I eat because I feel good that way, right? And it's been years of dialing it in. And I will eat. I was in Vancouver this weekend with a buddy of mine and my wife, and I wanted to try this croissant from a bake shop. And because generally I don't restrict myself because I don't have cravings for these foods, I bought one, I had half of it, and I thought, wow, I got the point and I'm good. Like, I don't need more than that, right? Like, I got the point. It tasted great. It was awesome. It was a fun experience. I had it with my coffee, and then I moved on. It's not going to set the tone for the rest of my day, but I also don't worry. Whereas in the past, I generally used to worry when I was younger that, eating one dessert is going to throw me off, because I'd see a lot of advice from people that were out there that said, sugar is the enemy. Sugar is going to destroy your body. Sugar is this, sugar is that. And as I learned more and more, I realized if the foundation of my health is good, and looking at my lipids, doing my blood work, looking at my MRI, which I haven't done your version to look at my visceral fat. I want to come in. We'll tell people, maybe I'll film that. I'll go down to your clinic over there.
Awesome.
I'd love to film that and show people me going through it. Optimizing my body composition and still working on that. I definitely grew up skinny fat, and I'm still working towards having a better body composition and adding more lean muscle mass. And even getting my advanced heart screening done through like a Clearly scan and seeing that I have super low soft plaque buildup inside of my heart. Obviously, I'm 41 years old. I want to keep it that way for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So I've generally seen that even I can get away with eating a little bit of quote unquote processed food here and there. I'm not eating at McDonald's on a regular basis or ever really, and still have overall be in the optimal category for my fasting insulin and other things. So I know I'm lumping in a lot of things together, but this is really an opportunity to provide clarification.
Yeah.
You were sharing that you want people to stay away from processed foods. Do you see it as sort of a spectrum? And do you see that people also can generally eat maybe some processed foods and still be healthy individuals?
I do. And, at the risk of maybe oversimplifying it, I think there are people that can eat processed foods, have the croissant experience, and maybe even fairly often and not get themselves in trouble. But on the other spectrum, or I'll even say that they can do it all the time. But on the other end of the spectrum are some people, many of whom are like some of my clients, who if they even take one little croissant, a little bit of one, they will be afflicted with cravings, and I call it start circling the drain. They'll just start binging and go down, and they will gain a rapid amount of fat. Usually it's visceral fat, and they'll have a much different experience than you. So what is the difference? The difference, in my opinion, is the microbiome again. And what happens are there are people that have a suboptimal. They don't have as strong of a microbiome. And so when they get exposed to those kind of type of foods, that it feeds carbohydrate loving microbes, of which there are species. Humans have macronutrients that are essential to our existence, or protein and fat and not carbohydrates. But I will say that there are species of microbes that are essential to have those simple sugars. They need them to survive. And so I think they have the capacity for influencing the host that they reside within. So I reach out to people and I like to educate them. If you are somebody that you are suffering from a lot of cravings, that you know when you eat these kind of foods that you become afflicted with it, then I would suggest that you don't beat up on yourself and think this is you and try to blame yourself for all these cravings, and understand that the microbiome isn't completely mapped out, and it's very likely the case that residing within your gastrointestinal tract are species of microbes that are dependent upon these simple sugars, and they're influencing the host that they live in, because it doesn't make sense. They don't have the capacity to leave the host and go out and find dinner if you're not going to feed it to them. So they're wired into you and create these cravings for it. So what do? I recommend to those individuals, stop feeding them. They die usually in hours, minutes to hours. And if you cut off the food supply, they die. Then you have to worry about making sure that you have intact within your microbiome the capacity to be resistant to them, because they're ubiquitous. But every time you go to Walmart and Target and touch a shopping cart, an elevator button, an escalator handrail, you're going to be exposed to other pathogenic, obesogenic microbes that are going to eventually get into you. So I help people to work with them to eat fermented foods to help populate their gut with good beneficial microbes that will help them be resistant to these craving ones. And very often the case, people that try that strategy, incorporating fermented foods into their diet, are able to resist the temptations that might afflict them. And so my explanation, a bit long-winded, to why you could eat that croissant, and other people, typically it's younger people, can eat croissants all day long and not gain weight, is and suffer from these cravings, is a difference in our microbiome. And so the microbiome represents a black box for us to learn more about. And I think in the future, FMTs, fecal microbiota transplants, will be potential sources for us to impact and help provide people effective, quicker treatments to help them with some of the challenges they're having, that I think are attributable to a suboptimal microbiome that we're still only figuring out. So FMTs, microbiome optimization, and getting started earlier by just eating fermented foods in your diet is a really sensible, in my opinion, strategy to help people become more healthy.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. we could probably do a whole other episode on just that. And I'm
Yes, we
excited to have
could.
you back on to do that. Let's provide some value on the other 4 areas that you broke down. Not that you haven't already touched on them, but a few clarifying questions. So we already talked about processed foods, and generally, I think you would agree, moving away from ultra processed foods for a lot of people, if they're still eating that, is going to help them across the board. And definitely most people should see a shift in visceral fat inside of their body and shifting more towards whole foods. And then there's going to be some personalization inside of there that people are going to have that they're going to have to figure out. And you've shared what your diet is. We haven't deep dived on it here, but you have other podcasts where we've gone really deep on it, like the Minimalist and a few others that we'll link to in the show notes. Alcohol, right? Let's talk about alcohol for a quick second. Did you grow up drinking, and do you drink now?
I did grow up drinking. I was relatively late. I don't think I maybe drank once or twice before I was legal age, and then I drank when I was of legal age, and I continued to drink, but I was never a heavy drinker. And today, I don't drink at all. I for most of my health journey, which has been 13 years, and I describe as a journey, I drank for most of that time period, and I would drink modestly, about a glass of wine, maybe 4 times a week. Not much. That's pretty mild by a lot of people's standards. But 2 years ago, I completely gave it up. The more I read on studies and saw the impact of alcohol, I determined that it was probably more problematic for me than it was beneficial. And many clients have told me, a shout out to Alex Huberman's podcast where he discussed alcohol.
Andrew.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Andrew, not Alex. Andrew. How he informed, I think, very effectively his community, how problematic alcohol was. A lot of people have just walked away from it and have never felt better after they did so. So today I don't drink at all. I have been dry for over 2 years, and I do, Drew, feel better myself. And every client that has done that has reported the same thing. Nobody, interestingly, has ever returned to drinking and said, I feel like I have to do that. But part of that, and I've heard that other places, part of that is, I think, once you become more healthy, your capacity for doing those kind of things become, 1, easier, and 2, more sustainable. And I think if you try to give up alcohol, maybe as just one strategy without really being healthy enough, I think you're going to have a harder time both maintaining that and benefiting as much from it. So I think it's part of the discussion in health. I like to say that health is a journey, and people ought not to think about it as a light switch where you have to do, it's binary, and you have to do it's either this or that, black or white. What is binary and black and white is a decision that you want to be healthy. I mean, that is important. And once you start from there, then you enter in on a journey that everybody's journey is different. But what you want to help define that is you want to get better, and you continue to get better, and you have a hunger and desire to learn about that. And then I think it can happen in a more natural and a more sustainable way. If you're doing this artificially for for some other purpose or for other people and not for yourself, and not understanding that when you are more healthy, you enjoy a better quality of life, then I think it becomes much more difficult, to your earlier points about sustainability.
Yeah, I've shared multiple episodes about how I never really drank growing up, never got into it, didn't see the point, then got really into health and was like, okay, alcohol is the exact opposite thing that I want to be drinking. And then I had a friend that opened up this really great restaurant in New York, which they've made a whole documentary about on Netflix, called Pure Food and Wine. And then for the first time I was like, oh, cool. Like, wine is great. Like, let me have some a little bit here and there. And that was also, this was maybe now almost 15 years ago, 18 years ago. There was a lot of sort of, still that propaganda that was out there about resveratrol and, hey, red wine and, you weren't really hearing a lot about the blue zones and sort of the incorporation of alcohol, but you were hearing that, oh yes, here's a good amount of alcohol that was there. But the thing that always confused me was that standard statement from doctors, which is, hey, yeah, drinking is healthy and it can be part of your life and it can help you live long, everything. But if you're not drinking yet, doctors don't recommend you start. It's like, what? Those two things actually like completely cancel each other out.
Yeah.
And so over the last year in particular, I went all out last summer for my 40th birthday, took a bunch of my family and friends to Italy. We all celebrated. We're having wine pretty much like every day, multiple meals together. Came back and just felt so puffy and got serious about a strength training program that I was doing with a local group here in LA called Ultimate Performance. And part of their protocol is removing alcohol when you're working out with them. And so I did it, which was not hard for me at all whatsoever, because I was what you would call a barely social drinker prior to that Italy trip. I would have maybe 1 to 2 glasses of wine a month. Maybe if there was a bunch of birthdays that were there, maybe 4 glasses of wine in a month. And even probably half of them, they wouldn't have been finished. So in removing alcohol, I felt like even at the level that I was drinking, which was very infrequent, I still felt so much better. Yes, I was also working out as well too, and I was doing all their behaviors, so you can't just say it was just alcohol in itself. I have been transparent with my audience that it doesn't mean that I'll never have a glass of wine. I had a glass of wine this weekend with friends, and immediately I saw my sleep, not the greatest the next day, and that means more to me than anything else. And so it felt like, okay, cool, that was cool. I'm glad I enjoyed it. I had it with friends, and I'm back to not having alcohol again. So I've shared a lot about that in my own journey. It's this dry wave that we're seeing is so exciting to get so many more people just decoupled from the hold and the tax that people are paying with alcohol without even knowing it.
Right.
All right, let's go to sleep. What are 1, 2, or 3 top recommendations that you have for people who want to improve their sleep and feel like it's off because they know that not only are they going to feel better that day, the next day, but it's actually going to be one of the key pillars to them reducing visceral fat?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I will start with my own anecdotal experience. One of the things that I've noticed is as I've become more healthy and I've adopted healthier strategies and purpose to become more healthy and just am more healthy, feel so much better, I've become exquisitely sensitive to the influence of particularly sunrises and sunsets. And so as a consequence, when it comes to the sunset, as the sun starts going down, it is as though a drug has kicked into me and I have got to get to that bed. And then the opposite happens in the morning as the sun starts to come up. I'm wide awake and very vigorous. So what I would share with people is the influence of light. And I think the capacity for light to have a measurable effect on you and to also be influence you is guided by your health. So it's very difficult, in my opinion, to have an effective strategy about sleep just doing 1 or 2 things. It's best not done in a vacuum, that you understand that your health plays a huge role. And so you should really come at it from a holistic standpoint that health and sleep are connected to each other. And to the extent that you become more healthy, you sleep better. And to the extent that you sleep better, you become more healthy. And so a few basic guidelines I give my clients is you got to stop with the unnatural. Instead of eating like processed foods, eat food in more natural, holistic form. Instead of influencing your brain and your body with unnatural light, exploit the benefit of natural light, sunshine. And then at the nighttime, a source of natural lighting that I've moved to are candles. And I like beeswax candles. So at nighttime in the Armara household, we are dimming our lights. We have pink Himalayan salt lamps and we have beeswax candles, and it is like a somnolent a drug that kicks in, and it eliminates all the stimulus that otherwise is competing, with our natural circadian rhythms and interfering with that. And so I acquaint my clients with the unnatural artificial exposure that we're constantly being attached to. And then with it, neurogenic exposure from electronic devices, cell phones and iPads and laptops and TVs. And even reading, if you read at nighttime, that's too stimulating. So you try to, ease into the evening and make a departure from all the busy stimulus and artificiality that is otherwise in abundance and people aren't aware of. So those few basic steps are important. And then eliminating, not eating directly before you go to bed, trying to eat earlier in the day so that your gastrointestinal system is less burdened by food as much as possible. And then I do think that some supplements are interesting to think about. I think magnesium helps people. Generally, it's the number one nutritional deficiency. So I have my clients supplementing with magnesium. It is the most commonly deficient nutritional deficiency in our country, in the world, really. And so magnesium and used with potassium in general, I think are beneficial to also help and maintain good benefits to other minerals. Like I like ancient salts, so I find them beneficial and for sourcing of minerals that we don't otherwise have access to. Our ancestors of old drink water, glacier waters, river waters, stream waters that were much more beneficial and abundant and minerals that we get today. So I think there's those lack of nutritional valuable substances, electrolytes, and minerals that are also beneficial.
And just to jump in here, sorry to cut you off. It's not that you're giving this checklist to every single one of your patients and saying they got to do all these things. You're partially talking about where you are in your health journey. Like you said, it's not an on and off switch. You're not telling people immediately tomorrow you have to do all these things, but you are being honest and transparent about your life, your household. I also find it fascinating that you're doing these things with 5 kids, right?
Yeah.
And a spouse. I'm sure that it's been a journey over a period of time of seeing which ones to include. Even me getting I don't like candles at night, but I do dim the lights.
Good.
And my wife is always, a second that she sees me picking up my blue light blocking glasses and putting them on, she knows I'm going to start yawning. And it like starts to set my nervous system to start getting quiet. And it's like, okay, it's that alert that it's like time to get ready for bed. And she's like, don't put them on yet. I'm not ready to go to sleep. And so we always had that little internal battle. But I always appreciate, but I want to make the distinction for the audience that I want the guests to all share honestly how they go about things. And from what I hear from you, just knowing who you are and seeing your content, it's not you're giving people a list of 30 things that they have to do to get right to, optimize their sleep, even prioritizing their sleep, having that circadian biology exposure of the morning sunlight, dimming the lights a little bit in the evening, not being on devices too late, and just getting away from processed and ultra processed foods. That alone is going to be improving, and alcohol, of course, is going to be improving your sleep quality.
Yeah, absolutely, Drew. And, there are a lot of people that sadly try to do too much or take on something in extreme, and then they have a bad experience. And so the consequence of that is that they may abandon their original, very beneficial interest in trying to become healthy.
Right. They're trying to do too much.
Yeah.
That's always the fear that's there, is that when people listen to every podcast, including my own podcast, we think that we have to do everything. And really, I actually really enjoyed your interview that you did with a minimalist that was there, because so much of what you were sharing is that we just have to get a few of these core things right? The working out and the optimal amount, which I'd love to jump to next, staying away from processed foods, sticking to mostly whole foods in our diet, right? Getting in some fermented foods along the way, and, not having that ongoing chronic stress from every category of our life. Of course, all of us are going to have some level of stress that's there. Those enough people see these aren't superhumans that you're showing the before and after on the scans for the MRI. They're normal, average, everyday people who came into your clinic, got their scan done, saw that, had that moment of like, oh shit, I have a lot of visceral fat. I need to do things. And you showed by just focusing on the basics, even just in a few weeks, people are seeing dramatic changes that are there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, I think, an excellent point. It's not only that a lot of people make the mistake of trying to do too much. They may try to do one thing too hard.
Yeah, they go too hard into one category.
Yeah, and or just one little tiny thing, like it might be exercise, just doing just all out extreme.
Can we talk about exercise, because you have a lot of thoughts on that? So give us your protocol, right?
Yeah.
Give us your protocol, because one thing that I want to make sure that we have the distinction on is that sometimes people hear that, oh, too much working out is detrimental. And you have examples. Again, these are sort of N of ones. You haven't published a study on it, but you're showing long distance marathon runners. You're showing people who are running 10 miles a day, which is not, 99.9% of our population that's even listening to my podcast is not even doing that much exercise, right? They're still struggling to get their, 150 minutes a week or whatever, 100 and whatever minutes. That's the recommendation. So you're saying extreme running, extreme long distance running, marathon running on a regular basis. That is where you saw the buildup in your own sort of data set of individuals building up a lot of visceral fat. But generally, you still recommend that people shoot for strength training at least 2 to 3 times a week?
Yeah. So when it comes to strength training, everybody wants kind of a number. We always have this preference, and I get it a lot. My followers, my clients that come to me, and what I tell them is nature likes variety. So mix it up. Sometimes you'll work out once a week. Sometimes you'll work out 7 times a week. Sometimes you won't work out for 3 weeks. Nature likes variety, but humans love schedules. I mean, we just want to go and do our 3 times a week workout. Now, I think there is generally, benefit to kind of having a certain framework. I like to tell people, give them an idea, because otherwise, if you get too much variety, you may miss the sweet spot that you're trying to get to.
Yeah, it's harder for people in the beginning when they're trying to build a habit. A lot of variety just kind of puts them all over the place.
I think in beginning, that's where some structure and the benefit of having some general idea to get closer to the Goldilocks approach. So I would say, from my own experience, my benefit and with clients and people I work with is I try to work out about 3 times a week. And I don't exercise very long. I exercise in a very intense manner. I like to get in, crush it, and get it done. And I think from an ancestral standpoint, the 2 type of exercises that I'm fond of saying that have been most beneficial and important to humans are sprinting, the ability to evade a predator or to catch prey, or to respond to a threat. Is extremely advantageous, how fast you could literally run. And secondly, your ability to defend yourself or to overcome prey or a predator, so your capacity for fighting. So today, it's impractical to suggest to patients or humans to go out and get involved in fights. There's obviously consequences to doing so, but you can exercise in a manner that might emulate a fight. And if you look, and this is what we did.
You're telling me I need to go fight somebody?
Yeah. Well, if you look at nature, what they do is they have these conflicts, and there are very intense physical confrontations, and so they're short and they're tense and they're over and infrequent. And humans are kind of the exception, where we exercise for a longer period of time. And I formerly was a police officer, and I have been in physical confrontations where, in law enforcement, you have to take people to jail that don't want to go to jail. And I marveled. I mean, my entire uniform career as a uniformed police officer, 3 years, I was in many fights, but they all went pretty good. We had lots of backup, and the bad guy went to jail, or a bad girl. And But when I got out of the Army, I went back into law enforcement as a reserve deputy sheriff to feed some adrenaline junkie needs that I had. And I had the occasion to get in a fight with a very bad guy that was very dramatically different. I was by myself, and it was the fight for my life that few humans ever have. And it lasted about 3 minutes. And it was absolutely horrific. And I thought I was dying, because I was going to die. And I thought I was dying during it because I was trying so hard.
Oh my gosh.
Fighting so hard. And it took me days to recover from the physiological challenge that my body went through. And so the anecdotal experience of going through that allowed me to reflect on the tremendous difference that our ancestors had. That would have probably been fairly typical for many of our ancestors of old. But today, few ever see anything like that. But that's what happens out in nature. And so I say to my patients and followers, you want to try to have an intense struggle without getting hurt. You don't want to fight somebody, but you can do push-ups and pull-ups and weightlifting to exhaustion to get you closer to that. And sprinting. Sprinting is a great way.
Yeah, talk about sprinting. Why is it that so many of the MRI scans that you showed were people that were before and after sprinting? What is it that sprinting does to the body?
Yeah, so sprinting has a dramatic effect, and the most dramatic effect in the shortest period of time relative to any other exercise. And in studies where they looked at, one recently, 10 forms of exercise, they looked at the release of molecules that get created in forms of exercise. And one of the interesting things they did is like what molecule gets created most in abundance. And what they found was a molecule called lactate, which is a combination of lactate and phenylalanine. It's a hybrid molecule, and it gets produced in the highest abundance, number one molecule that gets created in exercise. And they looked at specifically the form of exercise, and what they found was the one form of exercise that produced the most amount of lactate, which causes you to burn fat and build muscle, generally favorable physiological characteristics. You want more muscle and less fat, and in particularly visceral fat, is sprinting. And the one at the bottom of these 10 forms of exercise, the second one, before I go to the bottom, was weightlifting or resistant training. So that one largely would probably, in most people's minds, be maybe one of the most beneficial forms of exercise, but superior to weightlifting resistant training is actually sprinting. But at the bottom of the list of these 10 looked at was actually running. So running produced the least amount. And so as a consequence, when we exercise, we create these messaging molecules, these myokines that go out. They're released in our exercise, our muscles that are engaged in exercise, and they send messages in tissue further away, not just regionally. They also message and involved in physiological processes in the muscles that are engaged in the exercise. But they travel to tissues further out in the body that aren't necessarily involved in that particular exercise, and they tell those tissues to do things. So these myokines are very useful and helpful. I think we're going to learn more about them, and generally, I think it's a good thing to be involved in type of exercise that's going to build tissue that you are in most dramatic need of, and that is your fast twitch muscles. It is the fast twitch muscles that are most aligned with the quality of life that you live. At the end of your life, it is fast twitch muscles that allow you to get up and out of a chair unassisted, that are going to allow you to correct yourself when you're falling, that are going to allow you to pick up things like your grandchildren or groceries or something that you need to do, and to be able to get up and go to your car and have lunch with your grandchildren or friends. And it's not the slow twitch muscles. Now, if you want to run fast for a long period of time and that's important to you, then at least be informed about the fact that you're going to have to do so at a sacrifice of these fast twitch muscles. It's not completely black and white, but studies show you either engaged in exercise that builds one and diminishes the other, and it does diminish the other. It's not like it's neutral. Or you have to have a switch and do the other approach to it. So for me and for my clients, I try to tell them that you probably need to be thinking more about that you want to have a higher quality of life and you want to be able to enjoy that better than its fast twitch muscles. And so sprinting and weightlifting are going to be more beneficial than you running. And the other downside to running, which I think is worth pointing out, is if you look at marathoners and ultra marathoners and people do a lot of distance running, they're small. They don't have as much muscle tissue. And I'm not complaining about their appearance, but they are losing that muscle mass. And simultaneously to chronic disease is a loss of muscle mass, whether you're exercising or not. Sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass and muscle performance, is a real scourge in our country. And not enough doctors are talking about sarcopenia. In fact, recently I had a client share that he had lunch with a chief of medicine from a very prominent hospital. I'm not going to say where the hospital was, but everybody knows this hospital. And the client was talking about sarcopenia. And the chief, the head medical doctor, said, "What is sarcopenia? Never heard of it." You see the problem here?
Yeah.
So we got this huge, manifestation of chronic disease, sarcopenia. And many here are listening to probably don't know about the declining loss of muscle mass and declining muscle performance. It's not just that you're losing muscle, but the muscle does not perform as well. And so that is an example of what happens in people when they get older. Their backs are crooked because their erectae spinae muscles, the muscles allow your back to remain erect, are compromised, and they're not performing as well because sarcopenia is starting to afflict you. So yeah, I think exercise is hugely important, but you ought not to rush out there to Dhru's point and my point, and embark on this single wild, crazy investment in too much excessive exercise or even just one particular form of exercise. You want to have a variety of different things and make sure that when you start something, that your guiding principle is that you want to get better, not that you need to have dramatic overnight change or immediate change even in a week, because it's the goal here is sustainability and improvement and not dramatic overnight change.
Yeah, and for some people, that's literally going to be that they're living a sedentary lifestyle. They're sitting for more than 6 hours a day, right? They're getting less than 6,000 steps, right? Which is, I think the CDC says that anything less than 6,000 steps is basically a sedentary. In their sort of definition. Obviously it could be, varied for other people's definitions. So for them, it could be just even getting 10 to 15,000 steps a day and starting off and getting more and walking barefoot more often, right? Which I know you're a huge fan of and we've talked about in the podcast. For other people who have a lot of the basics or maybe had it one point in time and lost it, now doing strength training a couple times a week, right? 2 to 3 times a week and getting in 1 or 2 HIIT workouts, right? Could be the next stage for them. And for people who are pretty regular with those things, maybe the next stage is to start incorporate some sprinting, as you're mentioning. So you have to figure out where you are on the scale and stack up appropriately. But obviously it's clear from all the MRI studies, images that you showed, that sprinting in particular seems to be very powerful at attacking that visceral fat inside the body. Yeah,
it really is. I think it's a very attractive form of exercise. And, anecdotally, what I hear from a lot of my followers, and I have more followers than I have client patients, that they routinely say that it just gives them a vitality and a vigor.
Sprinting.
Yeah.
I feel alert. I feel awake when I do it. I don't do it under enough as, you're kind of talking about incorporating it, but you feel awake. You feel really alive.
Yeah. Now, I think it's really important if you're listening and you're a little bit older, like in your 40s, and maybe even your 30s, that if you have been sedentary, you must be aware that sprinting, you haven't done it in a while, that you're very much at risk for an injury. You can strain a muscle, pull a muscle, and in many cases it can be weeks or months or even more, like years to recover from that injury. Just recently, I don't know if you caught in the news, I think it was Kevin Hart, the comedian, took up a challenge at and I forget who it was, but somebody famous, challenged to a sprint. And so he went sprinting. I shouldn't be laughing, but he's a comedian. And I'm thinking about all the funny stuff he said about this, and also not so funny stuff. He actually tore his abdomen.
Ouch.
I don't know exactly what tore.
He went too hardcore too quick.
He did. And, he said, because I wanted to be the fastest, and he used a bad word at the barbecue. And so you got to realize that if you haven't done sprinting, I would recommend that you work with a personal trainer and start in a very slow manner, and be careful. And to put you at, I'd just like to make the point too, that, if you had that kind of an injury, because you sprint, you would have been eliminated from the gene pool, 100,000 years ago. If you got an injury, from sprinting, you would, as a result, live a life where you wouldn't allow yourself intentionally to accumulate chronic disease that would beset you with an injury like that. And that force on nature that previously existed for hundreds of thousands of years on our species is called selection pressure. And it's the influence from nature in our lives that would motivate an individual human to live the healthiest life possible, because it improved your quality of life and kept you in the gene pool. Literally,
you're not saying that we just want to sprint for the sake of it. It's actually important to our vitality. In the past, it was actually part of our survival.
Yes.
Today, it's really not so much of our survival, but it's more of our thriving ability. If we want
that's
to thrive,
a good way to describe it.
Right? So kind of like, not that I'm trying to be politically correct, you're not saying that if you can't sprint, you really shouldn't be here. It's more an indication
no, not at all.
Say that, look, don't be afraid of injury. Slowly work yourself up, work with a personal trainer, and get to a place where you can sprint, because that's a reflection of a lot of things that are important. It's going to be a reflection of your VO2 max, which we know is correlated with long-term health. It's going to be a reflection of your ability to have decent and good biomechanics inside of the body, right? And have some symmetry in how you run and things like that. And a whole host of other things. So sprinting is one marker of, and again, if you can't do it and you haven't been doing it, slowly work yourself up. It's just another indication that this is something that we should be able to do. It's kind of like when we have cardiologists on this podcast saying that, look, if you're a male and you suffer from erectile dysfunction, obviously their heart goes out to you, and we don't want anybody suffering from this, besides the fact that it's embarrassing if people are in a relationship. There's another reason why, is that if you have erectile dysfunction, it's a direct reflection of your endothelial dysfunction. So it's one of the first indications that you have heart trouble as well. So if you are reliant on a Viagra, a Cialis, or some other medication that's out there, sure, fine. We're not going to demonize these medications that are out there, but it's an indication that there's a deeper issue that's going on. If you can't sprint, we need to work on that, because there's a deeper issue that's going on.
That's a really good point. And, on ED, erectile dysfunction, it's really, you want to be sexually active. It's very beneficial to your health. And when you have erectile dysfunction, it is a reflection of a larger problem. And what we saw in our clients as they got rid of visceral fat, erectile functioning returned. So, and the dependence or reliance upon medications to assist the capacity for maintaining an erection was reduced. But another interesting phenomenon that happened, I've talked about a few times, is when a young male has an erection, once they reach the age of adolescence, maturity, and erectile functioning, starts taking on new important roles, they have a throb the erection, kind of a bounce from the pulsatile blood flow to maintain that erection. That bounce is lost as you accumulate chronic disease. So the first sign of erectile function is not the loss of the erection, but actually the loss of this throb. And so what is happening now with clients as they lose visceral fat, they get their erectile function back, and then they get this bounce back, which is an important feature.
They literally get their bounce back.
Yeah. It's kind of an interesting way to describe it. But so if you're listening today and you have an erection, but if you think about when you were, in many cases, people can't remember it because it slowly goes away. It's very interesting, 16 to 18. But when you get it back, you'll see it and you're like, now I remember I did have that. And it starts off very slow. It's a little tiny bounce, and then it gets much more pronounced. So
the more you reduce the visceral fat.
Yes. Yeah. And I think really what's happening, and probably you may lose a lot of that visceral fat, and your ability to heal takes some time. It's not just the loss of visceral fat, but the improvement in your stem cells, in your blood flow, and your hormonal endocrine system. Exactly. All these things in context and are consequences, beneficial consequences of the elimination of this chronic disease process, visceral fat manifestation. And so these things happen in composition and collectively with each other. So, but erectile functioning, I think, is an important one. I would love to see if there's a female, counterpart to that. Reproduction is an important aspect to our human existence, and fertility is an important part of the discussion. We see improvements in sperm count, how fast sperm cells swim, and how straight they are as people eliminate visceral fat. And I've had clients that have been infertile in their 60s and go back and get their wives pregnant, younger wives, through reduction of visceral fat and semen improvement. So there are many, many aspects to health and the quality of life beyond just your how you might look, how you might feel. Health is a very, very interesting but an important target. And hit that home. The decision is binary. You want to get healthy, but it's a journey, and nobody should have, a sense that they got to do everything at once. It's something that you want to embrace and do in a steady way that is sustainable, and you're going to benefit from it.
Yeah, most people are going to listen today, and on the list that you mentioned, stress, alcohol, processed foods, sleep, exercising too much, which is not most people that probably listen to this podcast. They're going to pick which one they might feel inadequate on. Usually people have a gut intuition. Yeah. And they might decide, you know what? I'm still doing a lot of alcohol. And even though my diet is pretty dialed in, I think my alcohol intake is a little high or maybe too high, and that's impacting my sleep. I want to focus on that. And that's your first domino, right? You put a little bit of attention on that. You try to dial it in. You look up the best practices. You listen to other podcasts that are out there, other episodes we've done, and you start to feel like you've made progress. You build up what researcher BJ Fogg, who's been on this podcast before, calls tiny habits. You build up these tiny habits that all amount to bigger things, all in the pursuit of destroying visceral fat inside of our bodies so that we can live longer and be healthier. Sean, this has been fantastic. I so appreciate you coming to LA and us having this discussion. We met on Instagram through a comment, and us getting tagged in it. And I looked up your work and I felt like, wow, we really have to have you on to learn all about how damaging visceral fat is. And I want to acknowledge you because you provided a ton of insights for our audience, not just about how damaging it is, which is super key. Half the problem is understanding how bad the problem is, but you also gave us action items on how we can take steps today to improve our health. Give a little bit of a lay of the land of your world. If people want to get this MRI, you actually do it at your clinic.
Yeah, so I do have a practice where I work with individuals who are motivated to try to improve their health and have the means and ability to come to Minneapolis to get the scans. A lot of people want me to work with them in their home state, but I'm a Minnesota licensed physician, so I can't practice medicine across state borders, and so they have to come to me in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities. I am working to expand my clinic practice down to Florida, and so hopefully in time I'll have a second location to be able to work from. But people can find me on Twitter, X, Instagram, and YouTube, all under at Dr. Sean O'Mara, DrSeanomara. And I have a website, if you're really interested in working with me, is just DrSeanomara.com. And then I'm on quite a few different podcasts and different opportunities to address people. My passion is trying to help people reverse chronic disease and improve their health. It comes from my own experience of having a very unhealthy body, and then being able to enjoy the benefits of improving my health. And now as a physician, I want to be able to do that. And I realize that people in the social media space outside of conventional healthcare have such a critical role in doing that. And especially you. I mean, your content, I was blown away by the quality of content that you're producing, the people that you had in your podcast, and you typify, Dhru, what is right about social media, the capacity to introduce, really beneficial content to people that otherwise conventionally wouldn't have access to it. So really, really happy and thrilled that you invited me to be able to share in your mission, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely do a part 2 and dive more into it, and maybe even some audience questions. One more thing. For instance, if somebody can't work with you, do you generally recommend that people try to find a physician in their area that would be willing to, usually you need a prescription to go in, to get an MRI done. Yeah. But then the question is that, do those doctors know how to interpret the data? Yeah.
So really good question. I do get that individually, but so many people will be listening today. So you have to get a physician to order the MRI. And so a physician order is required, and you can start with your primary care doctor. And I tell people to say, don't go in and try to expect the insurance company.
It's usually going to be out of pocket.
Out of pocket. Yeah. It's about $500 to $1,000. So you got to pay cash for that. And then I have videos, lots of videos on MRIs. If you watch today's podcast that Dhru and I talked about, you'll have a good idea just being able to read your own MRIs. You want very little, you want less white and more dark as the basic principle. And then look at other MRIs on the internet. And then I have YouTube videos on my own YouTube channel that talk about how to read and interpret your own MRI. And it seems funny, but doctors aren't doing it. And so I have a radiologist who's working with me now, and I have about 7 other doctors, and I'm slowly educating them about this. But it is going to be a while, so take a look at my YouTube channel and try to get your own MRI. And if you're able to come to Minneapolis and you're motivated, or maybe Florida in the future, I'd be happy to consider having you as a client patient.
Amazing. Maybe one day in the future also you guys do some sort of telehealth coaching, which isn't practicing medicine, and people can sign a waiver and say, hey, listen, you're not my doctor, you're not giving me medical advice, but they can do a consult with you.
Spot on.
I know a lot of doctors that kind of do that.
Yeah, I think we're talking about it. Yeah, I'm a startup now, so we're involved in that.
It's all being built. Well, Sean, you're doing it all. People will stay in touch with you. We have the links to all your show notes that you mentioned. Obviously, for people that are listening, check out the YouTube for all the images that we talked about, and the links to your social media and podcast, as well as, podcast is coming soon, but the YouTube channel that's out there right now. So you can follow Sean on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you. And this podcast wouldn't be possible without people like yourself putting out your story. So thank you again.
Well, thank you again, Dhru.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
The fail rate with weight loss is close to 90%. So we don't have a problem losing weight. We have a problem keeping it off. Nobody's looking at the big problem, which is what's going on? Why can't we keep it off? And a lot of it has to do with